I am the creative Contessa, and today we're finally getting back into the cookie party groove with a fantastic recipe for pomegranate chicken, which for those of you familiar with Persian cuisine will probably find is very familiar. So it's going to be a very interesting episode today. Welcome everyone. Oh, good morning, Brian. So first, of course, I'll start with the traditional getting dressed because I'm dressing Italian today because today's cookbook, Il Liber de Coquina, is actually a Sicilian cookbook from the 13th century, from the end of the 13th century. It's one of the earliest cookbooks that we have actually in Europe, and one that at least has this kind of level of detail. And it seems to come from the Anjou court of Sicily. And if you're wondering why I'm using a French word name to talk about the kingdom of Sicily, it's because Sicily has a history, thousands of years of history of various peoples and dynasties coming and conquering and setting up shop. And in the second half of the 13th century, the son of Louis the 13th, a Capetian from the house of Capet, basically led an expedition and conquered Sicily and then became its king for not very long, for a couple of decades. But this cookbook seems to come from that very brief window of time. And it's fascinating because it contains recipes that show such a very multicultural influence. We've got Arabic recipes, Middle Eastern recipes. We've got Catalan recipes. There are recipes that absolutely come from Apicius, that date back to Apicius over 1,000 years before that. Ancient Roman recipes, in fact. There are French recipes. So it indicates just how interconnected and multicultural the medieval world was, despite many people's false ideas about the medieval world being very isolated and local. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to be discussing a couple of important details today about medieval cookery. We're going to talk about the ingredients, what they would have been like in the Middle Ages versus today. I'm going to talk about some sources that you can look into yourself if you want to delve into medieval cookery, and not just medieval cookery, but medieval food. Because if you're going to recreate a historical recipe, it's important that you at the very least understand the kinds of ingredients with which our ancestors or medieval people, if they're not your ancestors, would have been working, and to understand how foodstuffs have changed so drastically in the intervening centuries. So just because something is called an apple in a medieval European cookbook, for instance, doesn't mean it's anything like the apples that you may be able to get at your local store. So even if you can't get the original heirloom cultivars that would have been utilized in, say, medieval Sicily, I think it's important that we at least understand the difference. Obviously, it's almost impossible in some cases to actually really get to the true heart of how these dishes would have tasted because those cultivars are no longer in existence. But in some cases you can, with some clever looking around and some clever research. So I'll point you in the direction of some sources that can help you on your own food history journey. Yeah. As always, if you're new to my medieval cooking party world, if you have questions about medieval food, medieval cookery, about anything I'm doing, feel free to pop them in the live chat. If you're watching this as a recording, I missed a whole hole. If you're watching this as a recording, then pop them in the comments, and I promise we will answer them as long as YouTube alerts me that their comment has been indeed made. So, I missed a hole really low down here. So today's Liber de Coquina is Coquina, because it's actually all sounds are pronounced in this dialect, it reads a little bit like Latin, but it's really also kind of a 13th century version of Italian. So it's actually not very hard to read if you have a basic grasp of Italian. And if you actually have studied Latin, then you can probably look at the original yourself. And I always find it's important to look at the original recipes. Oh, well, hell, I missed multiple holes. I got talking. I find it's very important to look at the original recipes in the original language, if you can, to verify that the translator has not made any gross errors. The problem with a lot of the translations of these cookbooks is that the person doing the translating isn't necessarily always someone who actually understands food or cuisine or has an in-depth, detailed grasp of medieval food culture or medieval kitchen culture, the kind of implements and ingredients that they would have had in their collections. And so translations of medieval text, historical text at all, can sometimes be wrong, just wrong. There's no better way to phrase it than that. They can just be very, very wrong. So it is actually important sometimes to be able to actually look at the original language and ascertain whether a translation is actually valid or not. Yeah. So, have any of you had chicken Fesanjan? It is a Persian dish that is eaten very, very commonly to this day, and it is a pomegranate chicken dish. Now, our dish today is actually going to be made with almonds. Chicken Fesanjan these days is generally made with walnuts, but walnuts do not appear very often in medieval European recipes, interestingly. We know they had walnut oil, but walnuts themselves don't seem to be used, at least not in the upper echelons, as an ingredient in cooking. So almonds, on the other hand, are used all the time. And so we're actually going to be making a pomegranate juice almond milk today. So that's going to be something completely different. I have never made this recipe before, so we will be going through it together. And as you're going to find, for those of you just coming around to the world of medieval cookery, you're going to find that a lot of details are left out of these recipes. The recipes do not include very important information such as quantities or timings usually. Very rarely are timings included. Very rarely are quantities included. So in the case of this recipe, no quantities except, no quantities at all. No quantities, no timings. And so we're actually going to be doing some real recipe interpretation here, which is referred to as redaction in the field of historic cookery. You okay?
Nose.
Oh. Okay, great.
Because they checked in the bag to see if they had any uncut pork.
They did not. Okay, well, I guess I should have specified a quantity. We definitely didn't need that much. That's okay. We can use it for something else. We can always eat more pork. We can always eat more pork belly. Right. So once I get my kerchief on, kerchief has vanished. Handsome, do you see where my kerchief went? Okay, could you fetch me a kerchief from the zipper box? Mine has somehow gone somewhere. God knows where. Okay. Okay, well, while we fetch an appropriate covering for my hair, because this is not appropriate, especially not for cooking. Let me see. I never studied Latin, but have found much of it transferred into the English language as much as any other non-Germanic language did. Yeah, so in the 17th century, it's actually starting probably in the 15th century, there is a massive adoption of Latinate terms wholesale into English, and that really intensifies in the 17th century with the Enlightenment. So modern English, therefore, now has thousands of Latin-based terms that it didn't have before the 15th century, 14th century, even Chaucer. Actually, by Chaucer, that process had already started, now that I think about some of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the original Middle English. So yeah, modern English does indeed have quite a bit of Latin in it. Also a lot of French, thanks to the Normans. Yep. The Smithsonian is running an article of Elisena of Montcalva tomb findings. Oh, really? I'll have to check that out. That doesn't surprise me, though, because everyone is running an article on it.
On what?
The tomb findings of that Catalan. Yeah.
Catalan.
Yeah. That's big in the medieval archaeology news right now. Yep, for certain. Did the felines overlords snatch the kerchief? I mean, it was literally right here, so I'm beginning to think they must have. Okay, so let's go ahead and first off talk about our source for the day. So the Liber de Coquina is available in translation as a separate cookbook if you wish it. But for those of you just getting into medieval cooking, I really do recommend this very easily. And I cannot mirror the, sorry guys, I can't mirror the camera on YouTube, but this says The Medieval Kitchen, for recipes from France and Italy. And it is a fantastic edition. It should be easily available from Barnes & Noble or from Abe Books. You'll notice I'm not mentioning the Jeff Bezos monstrosity. Please don't support that monster of a man who's just made himself rich on the back of exploitation. Anyway, he doesn't actually pay his fair share of taxes, nor does his company. So, medieval kitchen recipes from France and Italy. What I love about this source, well, I guess it is a source, but what I love about this particular medieval cookbook is that it provides a very extensive set of introductory chapters that talk about the culture of food, that talk about city dining versus country dining, talks about what the rich ate versus what people on the bottom 80% ate. There's a lot of fantastic context, historical context that is provided here, and I think that's really very important. It also then provides each recipe with the original recipe and then their translation and then their interpretation and redaction with a completely finished recipe with quantities and measurements and timing. So if you just want to cook medieval food and you're not interested in actually going through the process of struggling with the experimental level of the original medieval recipe, this does it. This allows you to do that, but it also allows you to interpret the recipe for yourself. The other thing I like is that while the translation is provided in the main cookbook section, in the back they provide the transcriptions of all the original recipes that they use, so that for those of you who are pedantic like I am, you can compare their translation versus the original recipe and come to your own conclusions as necessary. And of course, they also talk about the sources. There's there's actually, this one doesn't have footnotes, but that's my only complaint, that this one does not have footnotes, and endnotes are an aberration, so no book should have endnotes. So the medieval kitchen recipes from France and Italy. And so we're going to be working from the translation in here, but I did compare it against the original Latin, Sicilian Latin, and it's a decent translation. For those who don't know, in my past life, before the machines ate my career, I was a professional translator for decades. So I actually know whereof I speak when it comes to verifying whether a translation is a quality translation or not. Let me see. What were the differences between country dining and city dining? Finer, richer, less vegetables? Well, so as always, that answer is going to be different based on where you are in medieval Europe, because Europe is not a monolith. But for instance, in Italy, many wealthy individuals had homes in the city. They had their palazzi in the city itself, and then outside they would also have a country villa somewhere. And so when you're at a country villa, you have access to fresher ingredients and different ingredients than you might have in the city. So, it can actually make a difference in terms of, in the city, you might actually have more ready access to spices. For instance, if you run out of cinnamon, God forbid, then you might be able to send someone to the spice market, because there was a spice market, to procure some. But if you're out at your country villa, if you run out of cinnamon because your steward is a lazy bastard and didn't do his job properly, then you're probably not going to have access. It's going to make a big difference in what is locally available. People who live out in a small village that has easy access to the forest and the fields, they're going to have access to more fresh wild herbs and wild greens. And this is especially going to impact people on the lower ends of society, because in the cities, servants and whatnot aren't going to be able to have their own herb gardens, right? But if they're living in a small village, then they're going to be able to not only grow their own herbs pretty easily, because they're going to have access to, an easy patch of land, they're going to have access to what grows wildly for foraging. So kind of as a general broad strokes differences. Yeah.
Gingerbread House sent you, Jules.
Oh, Gingerbread House. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. So let me see. That's the style of text. I like my older text to be interpretations. 100 years old differ from today, specifically if it's a resurging language. Yeah. So the thing about history, it's a great point. And the thing about history in general, history books, is that new research is constantly coming out based in some cases on new sources. So assumptions or conjectures or conclusions that were reached 100 years ago might no longer be at all valid because in the intervening years, we've discovered so many sources. We have a fantastically snarky compendium on medieval English cuisine written about 100 years ago. And the author says, basically, it's an endless diatribe against medieval cuisine. And he has nothing good to say about it because the sources from which he was working were interpreted in a light that made them seem unappealing. But in the intervening century, so much reconstruction research has been done, so many new other cooking sources have been discovered and explored that indicate that his conclusions of medieval food being nothing but overspiced mush was absolutely incorrect.
But they couldn't have known any better.
Right.
You can't blame them for being ignorant
Right,
savages.
right. 100 years ago, they just didn't have enough information to reach better conclusions, but we know better now. So just keep in mind that older history books can be great because of the resources to which they had access, some of which have actually gone up in flames literally in the intervening world wars. And also because they sometimes actually reference sources of which we might now be unaware, but that still exist. So the footnotes in those old history books, I find the most valuable in some cases, or in almost all cases, actually. Yeah. Okay, so let me just make sure I didn't, oh, what the hell? Okay, that's an, it was not the best positioning. So let's go ahead and dive into our recipe. So format is, I will read the whole recipe in translation, not in the original Latin, although if you want me to read the original Latin, I'll be happy to do so. It's short. This is not a long recipe, but it should be a long recipe because there's a lot of little details. And I've been cooking since I was tall enough to stand next to my father and help and learn from him when I was about 3. So I have a very visceral understanding of cuisine and how ingredients work together and how heat and cold and all of these chemical changes occur based on your techniques and the physics involved. So I'll be applying that knowledge to help us interpret that recipe, which is why I'm saying there's a lot of steps that are just taken for granted in here. But that's true even of some modern recipes. If any of you have cooked with modern cookbooks, you will know that there are some cookbooks that are fantastic, that go into every single detail, like the America's Test Kitchen cookbooks. And then there are other cookbooks that basically just give you ingredients and the base steps and assume that you know how to do everything that you need to do to reach the various levels of processing that each of the ingredients requires, that you understand how to turn a stove on, for instance. So yeah, this is,
Do the Latin too.
Do the Latin too. Okay. We'll start with the Latin. Let me see, Romania, right, is number 34. Okay. Da-da-da.
Ironically, 3 years ago, we were in Florence.
Yeah, 3 years ago, we were actually in Florence. So for those who are wondering, I'm actually dressed today like a 15th century Florentine lady. And that is in part because I don't have any 13th century Sicilian court clothing, but also because this Liber de Coquina was actually copied heavily in the 15th century. And so it seems that it may have been an inspiration for cuisine in other parts of Italy in the 15th century. So it's not inappropriate, actually, for me to be making this recipe dressed as I am. Right. Yeah. Footnotes, yeah, which are half the page, and some of R.A. McAllister's work on the Irish corpus are filled with rabbit holes. Yeah, like honestly, so brief tangent into footnotes. Footnotes are absolutely rabbit holes, 100%. If just one good footnote can occupy me for hours, chasing down all the references that tend to be mentioned in them. That's a good footnote. A good footnote should cost me at least several hours of my life. Okay, to our recipe, everyone, to our recipe. So the original Sicilian Latin. De Romania. De Romania. Suffrigantur pulli cum lardo, e cepis iterantur amygdale non mondate, e distemperentur cum succo granatorum macrorum educium. Postea colletor e ponantur ad buliendum cum pullis et cum cocleari agitetur. E ponatur species. Potestamem fieri brodiam biride cum erbis. It's the whole recipe. Okay, now for the translation. I'm going to use theirs because I don't feel like doing a sight reading translation that might not be as smooth. Romania. To make Romania, fry chickens with pork back and onions, crush unskinned almonds, and moisten with the juice of sour pomegranates and sweet pomegranates. Then, strain the almond milk and boil with the chickens, stirring with a spoon. Add spices. You can also make a green brodo with herbs instead of spices. That's it. That's the whole recipe. So yes, as I said, no quantities, not even the number of chickens, no timings, not even how long you should cook it for, or any mention of the texture that should be achieved at the end. So there is so much room for interpretation on this recipe. Now, I've had many different regional varieties of pomegranate chicken from across the Middle East, and nearly always it is cooked into a thick stew. And I personally am a big fan of thick stews. Also, in a medieval cuisine context, a thick stew makes a lot more sense than a thin soup, especially at this level of dining, right? This is not a thin soup level of dining. This is absolutely royal cuisine or wealthy merchant cuisine or noble cuisine. This is definitely not something that your average peasant was making on a regular basis. But that doesn't mean, I should mention, medieval peasants ate a lot better than most people in the modern West eat now. Their diets had more nutritional density, were better balanced, and were the right amount of food, generally, instead of too much food and too much of the wrong kind of food. Peasants does not equal poor person at all. That word just means farmer. And just like today, there were farmers who were subsistence farmers who were just scraping by, and there were farmers who were doing decently for themselves, and there were wealthy farmers who could afford luxury items and did in fact purchase luxury items. So the word peasant does too much thinking for us, but does not convey the nuances of the different echelons within the peasantry category. So it is entirely possible that a peasant could have made this dish, maybe just not a subsistence farmer, right? So I just want to put that out there. That being said, this whole cookbook is definitely aimed at at people who can afford nicer, finer ingredients. For one, almonds were not cheap, no matter what, no matter where. They were not cheap. They could be less expensive if you lived in an area that actually cultivated almonds, or it could be more luxurious if you lived in a place that didn't cultivate almonds, say like Scandinavia. So remember that ingredients are very local, but they are often exported all over Europe. I even found in this 15th century cheese pilgrimage log that I found, journal, I discovered that in the 15th century, English cheeses, which were, according to this source, the preponderance of which were sheep's milk cheeses, by the way, were being exported all over Europe and were very popular at cheese markets in Flanders, in France, in Germany. And I think he even mentioned that some of them were exported as far as Italy. So the medieval world was definitely more interconnected than that for which people give it credit. And so it was absolutely possible that, almonds could be everywhere. Just the cost would vary.
Brian makes a good point. The first indication of that is almonds in the cookbook.
Right. The first indication of what?
That there's more travel.
Oh, right. Yeah.
First indication?
Yeah, almonds in the cookbook.
Almonds in the
Yep,
cookbook.
and the almonds are everywhere, found in all medieval cookbooks. As far all the ones I've ever seen, they all have some recipe that calls for almonds in them. And almond milk is a staple of upper class medieval cuisine. It was a Lenten staple because during not just Lent, but during all the 130 days of fasting that the medieval European calendar contained for Christians, you weren't supposed to eat dairy on those days. And so there's a lot of recipes that contain almond milk substitutes as a Lenten day dish. Now, it's not so much a question of whether, almond milk was luxurious or dairy milk was luxurious, why it would be on a Lenten day. The reason that certain foods are counted as being only suitable for feast days and not fasting days is because there was an association with certain ingredients, especially animal products, that they would inspire lascivious behavior because they're by nature hot. And so they will inspire people to feel lust, which they shouldn't be feeling on a fasting day. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that animal products tend to be excluded from the fasting diets of medieval Europe. Yeah, it's got nothing to do with the morality of it or anything like that. It's all about the humors, as many things are in medieval Europe. Is sheep milk cheese good? I've never had it. Oh my gosh. So Cassandra, have you never had feta cheese? So real feta cheese is made with sheep and goat's milk, not with cow's milk. Let's see, Pecorino Romano is a sheep's milk cheese. Manchego Iberico is a sheep's milk cheese. There's a lot of cheeses that you might have had that maybe aren't sheep's milk cheese. I love sheep's milk cheeses. They're my favorite cheeses. I can eat sheep's milk cheese all day, every day. And in fact, last night I made spanakopita, the Greek spinach and feta cheese pie, but without the crust and without the phyllo dough. So yeah, sheep's milk cheese, super tasty, absolutely. I forgot about the medieval cheese snob. Yeah, the medieval cheese snob, man. Pantaleone, he is da Confianza. He's fantastic. I love his snarky cheese log. It's excellent. The more I read it, the more I love it.
So glad I found that.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Pecorino, Manchego, these, and although Manchego is technically a blend of milks, but there is sheep's milk in it. Yeah. So there's a lot of cheeses that people may have had that they don't realize are sheep's milk cheese. Yeah. Manchego. Yeah, it's okay. I'd like to see the old recipe for almond milk compared to today's commercial one. Well, you're about to see it, Brian. Commercial. Okay, so let me just give you all a little hint about modern commercial almond milk. I have never, ever seen a true almond milk commercially available in any store. Granted, I haven't been to every store in the world, and I haven't, looked at all the almond milks that are commercially available. But almond milk should be like 2-to-1 almonds to water. Good almond milk should be 2-to-1 almonds to water, should be your ratio. And your average almond milk is like 5% almonds and 95% water, plus a whole bunch of other garbage that gives it flavor and sweetness and stabilizers. Medieval almond milk is generally just water and almonds, 2-to-1 ratio. However, today's almond milk is made with pomegranate juice. So how exciting is that? Right. So we're going to get into that in a moment. But yeah, if you're going to do a medieval recipe, don't use commercially available almond milk. It will not give you the right outcome at all. And I, unfortunately, one of the cooks I work with who didn't know these things when I started working with her, she made the big bad mistake of getting a flavored almond milk, and the dishes she made ended up tasting like Captain Crunch cereal. They were gross. It was gross. At least to me, it was gross. So yeah, don't get commercially available almond milk. It's really easy to make almond milk using modern equipment, but we're going to make almond milk today using the medieval method. Okay, so let's look at our recipe first and make some decisions. Okay, so the first thing it says to do is to fry chickens with pork fat back and onions. Right, that's the first step, which is interesting because the almond milk process is going to take longer than it's going to take that chicken to fry. So I'm actually going to change the order of the operations in this recipe, which you sometimes have to do with medieval recipes. It's very clear that medieval recipes are not necessarily intended to be a step-by-step guide that you can follow. In some cases, this is one of my theories about especially these beautiful manuscripts. And this one, Liber de Coquina, I made a post on Facebook and Instagram today with a picture from it, of one of the original pages. It is beautiful. It is beautifully illuminated, or not illuminated, it's beautifully calligraphed with some, like illuminated initials. It is a really gorgeous cookbook. And so I am convinced that this was composed by some head cook, some professional cook, as a gift for a king or a duke or a prince or a queen or a duchess or a princess, in the hopes that they would get hired based on the kinds of dishes and the kinds of ingredients that they can work with. So it's not that you definitely don't want to give all of your secrets away in your manuscript. You just want to lay out the basic outline so that you can impress your patron with your abilities and your knowledge. So sometimes I think they may have intentionally written things in the wrong order or in a less than optimal order, shall we say. Yep. What's just off camera? Oh, the wooden mortar. Yeah, we'll get to our equipment in a moment. Okay, but so first off, I should talk about the name. Romania is actually a Sicilian corruption of the word Rumania, Ruman, which is the medieval Arabic word for pomegranate, right? So just the name of this recipe betrays its Middle Eastern origins. So we definitely, for 100% certain, this is not a native Italian dish. This is a dish that was imported and rightfully became very popular. And there's actually another dish in the same source called limonia, which is an Andalusian recipe involving chicken, almonds, and lemons, right? So yeah, the
We did that one?
No, this is yet another one, but we made one like it. This one is different because it's actually thickened with egg yolks. It actually has a thickened sauce.
It was good.
Yeah, we might do limonia next week because I love the fact that the sauce is thickened with egg yolks, which makes a really nice custardy sauce. That sounds pretty tasty too. Okay.
I won't be here.
So, well, yeah, that's true. You won't. I'm so hungry. Okay, so we start with, to make rumania, fry the chickens with pork fat and onions. Okay, the pork fat back. Unfortunately, I was not able to procure pork fat back. Pork fat back is actually the skin, the rind of the pig, plus a little bit of meat that goes below that. So it's not really meaty. It's more about the skin and just like a very top layer of meat that's kind of bound up in the fat of the skin. And it's salted, so it's preserved. And that's what they would have had. That's what lardo is in medieval Italian. In case any of you are wondering, lardo is a false friend with the word lard. Never interpret that as just lard. I was unable to get fat back. So we're going to be using, therefore, could you unpack this and put some of it nicely on a plate for me? We're therefore going to be using pork belly that has at least some of the subcutaneous fat. I was unfortunately not able to even get skin pork with pork rind at this juncture. And that's my fault because I thought I'd ordered it from a food delivery service here called Coupang, and I didn't. So that's on me. So if you're going to make this recipe for real, it should absolutely have pork fat back in it.
But I tried to get you stuff with the fattiest fats.
Yeah, it would have been nice if it had the skin, but that's the rind, but that's okay. Yeah. So, comments. Yeah, a cookbook seems somewhat of a suspicious of things that could be reordered beyond the foodstuffs. Manpa would teach their kids the other possibility. Yeah, the cook was paid by the nobility to record it. Yeah, basically. And we have to remember that the recipes, your home, these are not home recipes generally. This is haute cuisine. This is for certain what we're doing today is haute cuisine. This is not your average workaday meal. Your average workaday meal for most people in the Middle Ages on non-feast days. Oh, that's great. Oh, perfect. Yay, at least that one does. Woohoo! Yay. Oh, it does have it. I thought it didn't. Yay.
These do have the,
that's
skin.
Great. Perfect. Excellent. It does have the rind. Yes. Okay. Because the rind has has components that will actually help thicken this. It has collagen in it. And so that will actually help thicken our stew. Okay, so back to everyday cooking. Your most of medieval Europe, again, broad generalizations are not necessarily my favorite thing, but broad generalizations anyway do kind of apply in this case. In most of medieval Europe, for most of the Middle Ages, most people on an average day were eating pottage, which is a kind of stew. Pottage would have changed based on the day, based on the week, based on the season. And so it could have had meat, it may not have had meat. It would have depended on what ingredients were locally available at the time. And so it would have changed from day to day. It wouldn't have been the same thing day after day after day. But that is probably what the majority of people were eating on normal days. Feast days are a different question, and actually there were 100+ feast days in the medieval calendar. There were a lot of feast days. There is one landowner in the 14th century, I think, who complains that his peasants aren't getting enough work done because of all of the feast days on which they don't have to work, right? So keep that in mind. What we're doing today is absolutely haute cuisine, and I would never pretend that it wasn't. Okay, so we've got these chickens and we have this pork fat back and we have the onions. So it's the pork fat back that tells us that the recipe has been somewhat localized, because for certain pork would not have been included in a Middle Eastern recipe from the Middle Ages. Islam forbade the consumption of pork and pork products. So that is something that has been added, and that does absolutely distinguish this from its original ancestor. And it shows us just how popular the recipe must have been that someone took the time to localize it. And Sicily in this era was still very multicultural. There was still a very large community of Muslims and Jews living in Sicily in this era. Sicily is also, in this era, in the 13th century, one of the premier medical centers of the Mediterranean and Europe. It's where all the best medical schools are. It's where research is being done. It's where innovation is happening. And you can get, people will travel. Wealthy people will travel to Sicily to get the best medical care from France. We have records of people going from France all the way to Sicily to get the best medical care. So also from coming out of Sicily in this era, there are books on dietetics. Books that tell you how to eat healthy, how to sleep healthy, how to live healthily, regimens of health. So this cookbook is part of that whole tradition, right? It's not living in, this cookbook doesn't exist in isolation. It exists as part of this greater cultural and scientific world of 13th century Sicily. And I know for any of you who know Sicily these days, I know that can be a little hard to believe, but it's the truth. Things change, right? Is pottage the stew that always stays on the fire and you just keep adding whatever you have to it? Alex, that's a great question. No. I mean, yeah, you could, it could work that way, right? You could have a pottage that sits on the fire for a couple of days, but that isn't what makes it a pottage. Pottage is really just a word for stew. So, you know, the what is that nursery rhyme, peas porridge in a pot 9 days old, right? Porridges could sit on the pot, could sit on the fire for quite a while. A porridge could, but you wouldn't want it to be too close to the fire because it would burn, right? So it would kind of maybe sit in the hearth, but it wouldn't necessarily be over the fire, because if you aren't constantly stirring it, it will burn. Medieval cooking required a lot of interaction from the people doing the cooking. Now, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, fatback is similar to pork belly used for bacon today. Yep. They do have a rind if you get the whole product. Yeah. Yeah, so so for those who don't know, by the way, for those who don't know, I'm in Daegu, South Korea. We don't have smokehouses here. At least not lots of them. There are some in the really trendy parts of Seoul, for instance. But yeah, so no, I have I've access to different kinds of ingredients than I might have if I were, say, in Europe or the Americas. So yeah, I could have gotten proper fatback if I'd ordered it from Coupang, but I forgot. But happily, we were able to get pork belly that actually does have the rind on. So that's good. We're going to have at least that. So we will have the collagen from the rind to help thicken our stew. So I am happy with that. Unfortunately, it came pre-sliced. We tried to get it as a chunk, but so, you know, you're not going to get to see me fighting with it as much as I might if it were one whole chunk of pork belly with rind on. But there we go. pork belly with rind on. So if you can't get fat back, Brian is right. Pork belly or a pork belly with rind on is a good, the second best thing you can get. The thing is, pork fat back in the Middle Ages would also have been cured. It would have been salted. So it would have, it would have some of its own salt into it, which informs our recipe today and might be one of the reasons that a lot of medieval recipes, or almost no medieval recipes, call for salt. Because frequently, one of the theories is that they were using salt preserved ingredients. Therefore, you wouldn't need to add salt because they already had salt in it, right? So that is something that we'll have to consider in our reconstruction today, because we don't have the salted pork fat pack. We have unsalted pork belly with rind on. So we're going to have to adjust for that in our spicing later on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, guys. It's been a while since we've done this medieval cooking party, and I'm just so excited to be back with you all again. What?
At least you don't have to add a bag of pork rinds to add flavor.
Oh God, yeah, bag of pork rinds, fried pork rinds. Actually, I love fried pork rinds, but I don't eat them very often. I generally only eat them when I'm in Thailand, because in northern Thailand specifically, it's actually one of the sides you get to dip into the lovely little sauces that will make your mouth hurt. Yeah.
Salt was kind of expensive.
Salt was salt expensive. Again, Europe is not a monolith. The 1,000 years of European history, medieval history, is not a monolith. So your mileage will vary. In many places, however, it was very expensive. So, if you live in a salt producing region, salt's not going to be terribly expensive. If you live on the coast where you can just go and evaporate seawater and get salt, it's not going to be terribly expensive. But if you live inland, if you live away from the centers of production, it's going to get increasingly expensive. And there were different grades of salt. This is something that some people don't understand about the salt trade. The salt that was being traded was the premium salt, right? But there are lots of places in Europe where there are brackish ponds, so ponds that have fresh and salt water, where peasants, where the people who are just, eking out a living, villagers, would actually go and use pans to cook the water down until they got salt, which would be a gray salt. It would not be a salt you would want to eat, but it was a salt that they used for practical purposes, like cleaning kitchen implements. So there are different grades of salt in the Middle Ages. The really fine salt, right? That was expensive in most places. And that's, yes, I know some of you are going to quote the word salary in Latin comes from the idea that you were paid in salt, but you were not paid in crappy, brackish marsh water salt. You were paid in quality salt. So yes, but salt was also expensive because that was one of the primary methods of food preservation in the Middle Ages, especially for meats and fish, depending on where you lived, right? So salt played a very important role in civilization in this era. And it's one of the reasons that people probably didn't suffer from food poisoning as often as they should have, if we think about it, right? So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, exactly. As Brian says, if you live on the coast, you can dry sea salt and, on the beach by making shallow pools. Yeah, it's still done today. Yeah, so if you live on the coast, salt isn't going to be such a big deal. In fact, depending where you live, the beach might be salt. I've lived in many different places, and I've spent a lot of time in Spain because of my study of the Spanish language. And in Alicante, which was a Phoenician settlement originally, there is a beach kind of nearby where the whole beach is salt. There is no sand. It's just salt. It's just a big, giant shelf of salt. And you can literally take your finger and just lick it. You shouldn't. I did, but you really shouldn't, because, the modern ocean is filled with garbage like mercury. But a long time ago, it probably wasn't full of mercury. 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, it wasn't full of mercury. So there are places where you can literally just go and chip the salt off of the beach. So yeah, absolutely. Depending on where you are, salt may or may not be expensive. In many places it was, however, very expensive. By the way, if you're enjoying this medieval cooking party, when we are going to start cooking here in a moment, I promise. If you're enjoying this medieval cooking party, then don't forget to like and subscribe. Double tap that screen if you're on a mobile device. Yeah, a salt beach. I'd never seen anything like it. It was amazing. And I was so excited by it. I, went down, licked some salt, and then my friend Antonino says, Raquel, no lo hagas. Don't do that, Rachel. And then I said, pero por qué? Sabe muy bien. But why? It tastes so good. And he said, because of all the pollution that's in the ocean now is now in that salt. God damn it. But he was right? All of the heavy metals. So that's why Himalayan sea salt is a great thing, or Himalayan salt is a great thing, because it's so old that it predates us poisoning our planet. Yeah. That's how you get whale jerky, a salt beach. Brian, that's awesome. I get you're kidding, and I love it. Okay, so we have our chicken, and we have our pork back, and we have our onions. So I have here 2 yellow onions. Let's briefly talk about the onions of now versus then. Onions in many places, the commonly available yellow onion has been intentionally bred over the last 100+ years to have thick skins, to have these thick papery yellow skins, so that they can be stored for longer and they can be transported for longer. But medieval onions didn't have these skins, which is why we have no evidence of onion skin dying from the Middle Ages, because it seems they didn't have those skins. And onions in the Middle Ages came in a lot of different shapes and varieties, just like they do now. A lot of onions were a lot of times when a recipe calls for onions, it might actually be calling for what you would call a spring onion rather than these bulbous round onions. However, if you ever want to get an idea about what medieval versions of these foodstuffs, how they looked, then you can absolutely, I highly recommend books such as Tarquinium Sanitatis. So Tarquinium Sanitatis it's a book on medieval health, but it's fully illustrated. And each of the things in this book are somehow related to health, and a lot of them are foodstuffs. And so there's these fantastic depictions of, say, what a cherry tree looks like in the Middle Ages and what cherries looked like in the Middle Ages. So you can get a good idea. Like, this is cabbage. You would probably not have recognized that as cabbage, would you? But this is how cabbage looked in a lot of places in medieval Europe. This is before we started breeding it to be round, compact versions that we have today. So if you want to get a good idea of how medieval cultivars of these foodstuffs looked, or even animals, there's one here there's one here that shows, you might think it's a boar, but it's not a boar, it's a pig. And it's under the one for acorns, right? You might think that's a wild boar. You would be wrong. That's a pig. That's a domesticated pig in the Middle Ages, right? So Tarquinium Sanitatis, and there's other health manuals that have similar levels of illustrations in them. It's a great way to get an idea as to how the medieval versions of these ingredients looked. And there's lots of the pictures are available online, so you don't necessarily have to buy a beautiful book like I did. But look at this book. Isn't it beautiful? Look at that cloth binding. Bibliophiles unite. Beautiful embossing in gold. I mean, I love the feel of the fabric binding. Any other bibliophiles out there? Hi.
Just turn the camera and show them my pile of books that I've just.
Oh yeah, we've been cataloging all of our latest additions to our private library. We actually have so many books that we actually have an online card catalog. So we've cataloged them all, Dewey Decimal them, labeled them, and Library of Congress cataloging system. Anyway, not Dewey Decimal, but it is Library of Congress Decimal.
Be curious if I know Dewey Decimal.
Okay. So. One of the first things I'm actually going to do. Well, first off, let's talk about the preparation of these pieces, these ingredients. It doesn't say anything about the size of the ingredients, right? To make rummanah, fry chickens with pork fatback and onions. It doesn't say anything about whether the chicken should be whole or should be in pieces. It doesn't even say if the onion should be chopped or sliced or just tossed in whole. The pork fatback, again, sliced, cubed, tossed in whole. So this is where we already start having to interpret this recipe to make it something that's edible. Now, I have, this is our chicken. Isn't it cute? Yeah, little Korean chicken, still has its neck. Right. So I have a whole chicken here, and it is entirely possible. It could be that this chicken should be cooked whole. 100%. That is a thing that absolutely happens. And then at the end, when it's time to serve it, the chicken could be removed from the pot, could be carved properly, and then plated up, and then the sauce, the resulting sauce from the cooking could then be poured over top of it. That is absolutely an option. An option could also be to cut it up into parts and put them in. It also doesn't say anything about skin on, skin off. I think the skin should stay on. One in medieval cookery, even at the upper echelons, is very conservative of materials, meaning you don't waste things if you don't need to. Two, the skin is going to give collagen and fat and therefore flavor to this dish. And it might turn out that it's too much, but the good thing about Korean chickens is that they're not obese, scary monster Purdue chickens. So there's less fat in their skin than there is in an American, your average commonly available chicken that you would just pick up at your average American grocery store. For those of you living in other parts of the world, you have a different factory farming situation than America currently has. So hopefully you have less fatty chickens also.
What does happy chicken mean?
Oh, what does a happy chicken mean? Oh, happy chicken. All right. Susan says happy chicken. Yes, this is a happy chicken. This is what they call in Korea an animal welfare chicken. The animal welfare label in Korea is actually very strict and very strictly monitored and regulated. And so yes, these are free range chickens that actually got out into grass and fresh air and sunlight and ate grubs and all of that. So yes, this is a happy chicken, Susan. If anyone's wondering if it's a happy chicken, we're not talking about its mood. Oh, El Jodedor, welcome. I just love saying your name so much. Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenido.
What's the name mean?
The fucker. Sorry, everybody. I don't usually drop F-bombs, but I was just doing an honest translation. Oh, I'm absolutely not vegan, not in the least. I love meat. Love meat. One of my favorite cuts of meat is pork belly. Pork belly, my friend. Yeah, happy chicken sounds better than Beyond Burger. Beyond Burger scares me a little bit. It is like a Soylent Green, right? Like Beyond Burger strikes me like Soylent Green.
People.
Right. Because what is really beyond cow? Well, let me tell you what's beyond cow. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to consider. Are we going to cut up our chicken or not? And I'm kind of two minds. I can absolutely cut this baby up. I know how to, and I have the tools to do so. On the other hand, it is really easy to just, fry it, to boil up a whole chicken. But the part that makes me think it probably should be cut up into its constituent pieces is that it says to fry it. Yes, you can absolutely fry a whole chicken. You can turn it, but I really feel like it's probably going to be in at least 6 pieces probably. And that makes it a lot easier to get them nice and golden, to get that nice Maillard effect on all more surfaces than if you're just, fighting with a whole chicken. So we're going to cut this baby up. We are, but I wanted to use a whole chicken rather than boneless to kind of get closer to the intention of the original recipe. Almost all of these recipes for meat are bone in. Medieval recipes, many of them, there are ones that say remove the bones. Most of them don't, though. And I think that's intentional because people would actually eat the marrow in the bones. Like they would crack the bones and they would eat the marrow. So bones weren't considered a waste product. They were considered a food product. They were considered something that you should eat. And, so there are pie recipes, and I was going to do a post on this. There are, because I recently found a description in a book, Medieval Book of Etiquette, that talks about opening up the pie and pulling out the chicken and meat that's inside of it, carving it up and serving it, telling you that medieval pies weren't eaten the way we think of pie now. The pie crust was a cooking vessel, and the ingredients were what really mattered in these particular coffin-style pies. So I'm pretty certain that it should be a whole chicken that's cut into pieces with bone in and skin on. We're going to leave the skin on. We'll see. We may regret that choice. We may regret that choice, but we're going to go with it anyway. Right. So then the other thing to think about is how much fat back. We don't know. I'm going to make a guess that it was probably, for this whole dish, it would probably be a couple of ounces of fat back for one chicken, because you want to balance the saltiness and the flavor, because fat back is pretty flavor intensive. It's not quite like bacon, but similar.
Too much.
Yeah, you definitely. It's okay. It's fine. We'll make use of the rest of this pork belly. Pork belly is proof that God loves us. So yeah, so I'm pretty certain it's probably going to be a couple of ounces of pork fat back relative to our chicken. And then onions. Onions. I'm going to go with this much onion, because this is about the amount of onion that chicken Fesanjan would use for about this much chicken. Right? So yes, I am absolutely using my knowledge of modern cuisines, or traditional modern cuisines, which apparently must absolutely been medieval based on this recipe, to help inform our interpretation. And that's fair. In the absence of other information, you should use your own knowledge in interpreting a medieval recipe, right? Yeah, but Solon Green is people. Yep, that's exactly right, right? Okay, so here's the thing about onions. Some of you might not know. Onions, when you slice them, actually, this is true of all the lily roots, all the members of the lily family. So garlic, for example, shallots, green onions, leeks, right? All the members of the lily family. When you cut them, you actually unleash a chemical reaction. You literally trigger a chemical reaction that increases the micronutrient profile of the onion. But the reaction isn't instant. It's a timed reaction. And the longer that you let the onions sit after cutting them, the longer you let the garlic sit after crushing it or chopping it or mincing it, the more micronutrient benefit you get. So whenever there's onions or garlic in a dish, I always cut them first. No matter what stage they come at into the recipe, set them aside while I prepare my other ingredients. So we're going to go ahead and start with that. And then I can take your questions. I didn't rinse these. I can take your questions and chat about other things while we chop onions, which won't take long. You'll notice I'm very fast at preparing pretty much any ingredient. Okay. So we have here an olive wood cutting board that I purchased in Florence several years ago. We know that they used cutting boards because they appear in lists of items that you need to run a good formal dinner, and specifically for the items that are in the kitchen. So yeah, if you were ever wondering, did medieval people use cutting boards? Yes, they did. And I'm just going to label that down. Yes, now you can actually see me cutting. Oh God, we really need to sharpen these knives, Handsome. So badly. So badly. Now the question is, how would these onions have tasted relative to medieval onions? I haven't actually found any good information on that. I'm going to raise the camera a little bit. Oh, that's not raising the camera. That's the opposite of raising the camera. Okay. Raise it a little more. Okay, there we go. So I haven't been able to find any information on that. It is likely, though, that in general, when we have a sweet version of something, it generally tends to be a more recent iteration of that item. So it is likely that onions were probably not generally sweet in medieval Europe, right? The other thing we have to consider, how are we going to prepare this? Should it be sliced? Should it be chopped? I'm going to go with chopped because chopped, this is all supposed to be cooked together. And so chopped onions are much easier to manipulate than slices are when you have other ingredients in the pan. Also because most of the recipes for Fesanjan that I've seen, and I've seen a lot because I love chicken Fesanjan and I love making it, it's chopped onions. It's not sliced onions. So we're going to go with chopped onions for this recipe. And then another thing we will have to consider is, should we actually put this all together at the same time, or should we add it in stages? Yes, the recipe says fry the chicken, the onions, and the fat back together. But as I was saying earlier, it could well be that this is not supposed to actually be a faithful representation of the recipe and its stages. This is just supposed to be a resume by a professional chef showing off their knowledge, and that in some cases, the order of operations may be intentionally incorrect, just in case, you know, said patron or said ruler decides not to hire the cook and instead hands this to their cook, and then their cook messes it up, right? Like I know that sounds maybe far-fetched, but really think about it. You do not want to be giving away your cooking secrets for free. You want to use your cooking secrets to get hired. And in fact, medieval books of astrology and alchemy are similar. They contain recipes. Some of the recipes are booby traps. They are meant to punish people who attempt to just use the book without actually having undergone an apprenticeship. Because apparently, you know, astrologers and alchemists who would have undergone the apprenticeship training process would be able to look at a recipe for a talisman or a concoction or a potion or an elixir and recognize that following it exactly as it is in the recipe is going to kill you or someone else. But someone who hadn't undergone that process and was maybe trying to circumvent the whole apprenticeship aspect of becoming an alchemist or an astrologer would therefore pay probably with their life, actually, if they actually followed the instructions as it.
Alchemist breaking.
Yeah, alchemist breaking bad, exactly. Whew. Yeah, these yellow onions, they really do get you. By the way, for those who don't know, if you wear contacts, you will not be impacted by onions and garlic when you chop them. They protect your eyes really, really well. And you can get contacts much better than goggles, by the way. And you can get contacts that won't actually change your vision, that just change the color of your eye, for instance. So if you need protection, good, effective protection from onions and garlic, contacts for the win. Oh, your dress is beautiful. Thank you. Yep.
Chives or onions?
These are onions, not chives. Yep. These are yellow onions, just regular old yellow onions, which is what is used in chicken Fesanjan recipes to this day. Oh, we didn't put you didn't put a new liner in the thing. Okay, onions are chopped, so we're going to just put those in a bowl and set them aside while we prepare our other ingredients. So the chicken. Should we cut the chicken into pieces? Yes, we probably should. I think that is probably the best thing for this particular recipe. Oh, we're almost out of bags? Right, so I do think we should absolutely cut the chicken into pieces, because that will make it cook more evenly. That will make it so that we can fry it up nicely, get that nice Maillard effect on all the sides, because that's the only reason you would fry it first, right, is to get the Maillard effect. So if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right. Chicken. This knife may or may not be sharp enough for this. I might have to cheat because I just realized we really do need to sharpen our knives.
Been a little while.
It's been a couple of years since we last had our knives sharpened, and I do a lot of cooking, so we should probably get them sharpened. Yeah, I do. I teach medieval dance. I am a general medieval living history person, so not just cooking, not just one thing. I like it all. I'm very fascinated by daily life in the Middle Ages and medieval culture in general, across not just Europe, but Asia as well. So I would say that I have many, many interests, research interests, recreation interests. Dance is actually one of my bigger, more visible living history interests, shall we say, and people hire me to go to their events and teach medieval and Renaissance dance workshops, to organize and lead medieval balls. I have lots of experience of recreating medieval and Renaissance balls from, like based on primary sources describing them. I work with live musicians all the time who are professional medieval musicians. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of different skills, a broad skill set, shall we say. And on this channel, in fact, if you check out the channel, there's a whole playlist of medieval dance, including full tutorials of medieval and Renaissance dance, step footwork videos. You can actually see recordings from live stream recordings from balls that I've hosted in other places in the world. And at the end of July, the beginning of August, I will be hosting a ball at this 2-week medieval festival called Penzik, and I will be live streaming it. So even if you can't attend Penzik, you can join in the ball through the live stream. You'll get to hear the music, you'll get to see people dancing, you'll get to hear me calling and leading the dances, you'll get to just be, as part of the affair as you can be without actually being present. Bones. So yeah, lots of different things on this channel, not just food. Food's only one of the many passions in my life.
Oh, they're asking what your job was. What is your job?
Oh, right. This is my job now. Professionally, I am a translator, but the translation industry is dead. It is dead. It was killed. My job was killed by machine translation and now AI, for certain. So yeah, that was my profession originally. And then once I realized that there was no future in translation because they wanted to pay me poverty wages to do the same work I was doing 20 years ago, and now they just don't even want translators anymore at all, more or less. They just rely on translation apps. Most people do, because my languages are European languages. I don't have any cool exotic languages like Urdu or Swahili or something like that. So for those languages, translation is basically dead. And if you are studying translation at a university, the professors will tell you there is no future. The only reason you should do it is if you want to do it for fun. That is actually a thing that professors are really honest to God telling their translation students now. So I basically started instead, I looked at the skills that I already have in medieval, in experimental archaeology, in handcrafts and cooking. And I basically turned, these knives so sharp, so dull, really need to sharpen these. I basically realized that one of the things at which I'm very good is teaching, and I'm good at teaching skills, and I have all these really fun handcraft and cooking skills and dance skills. So I basically started the Creative Contessa as a business. So people hire me to, I do all kinds of things with it, actually. I can go to fantasy and historical events and lead dancing and dance workshops. I lead sewing workshops. I also teach cooking events and embroidery and crafting events. So yeah, I do a lot of things, but this content creation is now part of my profession. I do this full time. I spend hours and hours researching and writing up posts and coming up with neat videos. So this is kind of what I do full time now, really.
And you're working on a professional paper.
Oh yeah, and I'm doing professional research into the history of Korean clothing. So I've got a lot of irons in the fire, shall we say. Okay.
Yes, how is Dr. Minji?
Oh, Minji is doing very well, but she's crazy busy with this the new position she has at the Fashion Institute of New York. Just saw her this past 2 days ago, and she's here in Korea right now, and we're going to two of the premier museums for medieval and early modern clothing, Dankook University and Chungkook University, on Wednesday and Thursday respectively. So I'm excited to see what they have on display in their collections. They've got tomb garments on display from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. So I'm really excited about that. We're not going to be looking at them. We'll be looking at them through the glass case this time. I'm not going to be looking at them in person as I have recently, or in my hands as I have recently.
It's near Slippery Rock, right?
Penzic is near Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. It's north of Pittsburgh. Yep. Okay. So here we have the sad, basically top half of the chicken.
Angle down just a little bit. And you can see the.
Can you angle down? My hands are covered in raw chicken.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah. So we have roll angle. Yes, stop. Okay, right. Okay, so here we have the back of the back of the chicken. So I'm actually probably going to save this for stew.
The sad happy chicken.
The sad happy. That's a sad happy chicken, for certain. I'm going to save this for stew, and again, the recipe doesn't say to do that. Could you take Taquinem sanitatis and put it somewhere where I won't get chicken juice all over it?
Fine.
Thank you.
Book of files.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm probably going to save this actually for stew. The recipe doesn't say anything about that, so that's just something I'm going to do, or stew or broth, making stock. This will make a really great stock. And just won't be so great in this because there's not much meat left on it, although I might take these chunks of meat and just toss them in. Yeah, I really do need to sharpen my knives.
Well, since you talked about your hands being covered in chicken grease, how did they wash their hands back then? I had to go camping, and cleaning our food/cookware was a problem.
Yeah, so cooking is much more primitive, camp is a good question. How do you clean your hands in the Middle Ages? With water and sometimes with soap. They washed their hands all the time. Hand washing was a very important part of medieval daily life across all levels of society, it seems. Soap was not necessarily expensive. There were expensive soaps, like soap from Castile soap was expensive. That was a luxury item, but you can make soap really easily from ash and potash and fat, any animal fat, right? Or even, you don't even need animal fat. You could make it with almond oil or olive oil, both of which they had in medieval Europe. So yeah, they would wash their hands with soap, but very frequently hand washing was done at the table for dining, especially in the haute cuisine, right? They would actually wash their hands at the table. Two servants would come by with a ewer and a pitcher and a towel and an aqua manil, basically, and they would actually pour the water over your hands, and the water would be scented with lavender and or rose petals or something like that. Sometimes spices as well, and you would actually wash your hands right into the ewer, and then they would hand you a towel and you would dry them off. But we know that they had soap. We know that they used soap. So, hands were washed, but even just water is very effective at hand washing. People underestimate the power of the universal solvent that is water. But hand washing, very important. People seem to conflate, like, camping is the way life was like in the Middle Ages. No, medieval life was much more sophisticated than modern camping is. And if you have a running stream nearby, you go to the stream and you wash your hands in the stream. It depends on where you were. Depends on what kind of natural resources you had around you, what your living situation was, what your architecture was like. There were buildings, there were castles, palaces, homes that even in the Middle Ages had piped in water. The tower in London had hot and cold water on demand from spigots. So I know that's probably surprising to many of you. So, depending on when and where you were in medieval Europe, you might have actually had plumbing, shockingly. But otherwise, there were cisterns for collecting rainwater, and rainwater was recognized largely to be one of the cleanest sources of water, not surprising. And there were wells, rivers and running water everywhere. And it was generally acknowledged that you wanted the water from the flowing body. Like, medieval writers talk about this. If you're going to go and get water from out in nature, try to get it from a good, clean running source. So, and in fact, in the 14th century, we have primary source evidence by the Ménagier de Paris talks about the Seine river, the river that flows through Paris, that allowed Norsemen to go and pillage Paris. The Seine was the cleanest source of water. The best water in Paris, he said, comes from the Seine. If you want good clean water, go to the Seine. I wouldn't want to touch the water from the Seine with my bare hands these days, let alone use it to cook or drink or bathe or anything. I would assume raw foods were not very popular due to the natural fertilizer. That is correct. That is actually a very good point. Hold that thought while I think about the raw chicken that we have right now. Okay, so I'm just going to put the raw chicken aside for the moment. Okay, so we have our pieces, right? Bones still on in most cases. Set these off to the side. Now, the nice thing about using chicken with skin on is that the fat will self-render out as it's cooking. The bad thing is that before the fat renders out, sometimes it will stick to your pan and start burning, so you have to keep an eye on it.
Do you know where onions are from?
Where onions are from originally? Yes, actually, I did look. So onions, I read that onions originate actually in Asia.
Oh.
They originate in China.
So Central Asia
Yeah.
are the closest wild cultivars to the egg,
Right.
whatever the onion is.
Yeah.
But they don't know where the actual common cultivated onion is from, because
Right.
it's been cultivated for too long.
Yeah, so the onions have been, that's what I read. And onions have been cultivated for so long that we're actually, the origins are a little unclear. But the onions that are commonly used now in the West, the closest cultivar is in Central Asia. So the theory is that they may have started in Central Asia and spread out from there, but it's actually a little unclear when you trace back far. But onions have been propagated throughout your Africa, Asia for millennia, plural. So it's been a while. They've been out in the world a while. Chickens too. The earliest representation of a chicken in Europe that I could find was a depiction in a Phoenician city from like the 8th century BC. So chickens have also been in Europe for a very long time. Pomegranates, and I'll show you, we have pomegranate juice ready to go. Isn't that beautiful? So this is a replica 15th century flask. Isn't that gorgeous? Hand blown by Historic Glassworks, right? And it looks so beautiful with the pomegranate juice in it. So pomegranates came to Europe, and by at least the Romans, but possibly while the Etruscans and the Phoenicians were there. So basically pomegranates have been widespread in the Mediterranean since at least the Roman Empire. So pomegranates in the Mediterranean are not an exotic ingredient. They were ubiquitous by the Middle Ages. And if any of you have been to the Mediterranean when the pomegranates are blossoming, literally the sidewalks are just bloody red with smushed pomegranates, because they're so ubiquitous that people don't even bother to harvest them in many cases. They just let them fall and hit the ground. Sort of like in Korea, how they just let those nasty things I don't like, the persimmons. They just let the persimmons hit the sidewalk and keep on walking. Yeah. Oh, was there a question about pepper?
There's no. Roman pepper is closer to Indian.
Roman pepper was imported from India. Was imported from Sri Lanka, actually. So in ancient Rome, they would have had black pepper or long pepper, or in medieval Europe, they would have had long pepper or black pepper, and I think they had long pepper in ancient Rome too. I haven't done as much research into ancient Roman cuisine, but it all comes from Sri Lanka or from India in the Middle Ages. There's no locally grown pepper. And chili peppers, everyone, I know everyone always gets really disappointed when I say this, but chili peppers, any bell peppers are also count. Any kind of pepper that is not peppercorns, right? Capsicum. Those are all New World, all of them. They come from Central America originally, and they were part of the Columbian Exchange. So before Columbus did the thing he did, there were no potatoes, there were no peppers, there were no tomatoes, there was no maize, corn, there were no green beans, there was no vanilla in Europe, Africa, or Asia. So you have to imagine European cuisine, African cuisine, Asian cuisines, plural, obviously, none of them had peppers, no chili peppers in your curries. No potatoes in your Irish stew. No corn on top of your disgusting pizza. I mean, pizza should be good, but pizza with corn on it, with maize on it, is gross. Sorry. I will be fully judgy on that in that regard. So yeah, you have to imagine how different cuisine was before the Columbian Exchange. And the same thing for the Americas. Imagine, I know some of you have heard this before, but you'll hear it again. Imagine Mexican cuisine from any given part of Mexico with no pork, with no beef. Let me see, I think chickens also were introduced. I don't know if jungle fowl were already part of the Americas through either the land bridge or whatever. But for certain, pork and beef were introduced by the Spanish when they came over and brought their big animals with them. So, and no cumin. Cumin also came from India, basically from the Spice Islands, from the South and Southeast Asia. So no cumin in any cuisine anywhere in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange. And yes, imagine a world with no chocolate, because chocolate and vanilla both came from the Americas. Chocolate came, from Central America, more or less. So different world. So that's why medieval cuisine, if you ever see a medieval recipe calling for pepper, it's peppercorns. And if it's calling for long pepper, it will call for long pepper. If it just calls for pepper, they just mean black peppercorns. If they want long pepper, they will specify long pepper, because that was a different kind of pepper and they acknowledge that. Yep. A taper burrito. Let me see. There has been a newer theory of Roman to Indian silk trade overland route. I'm sure spices were also part of it. Oh yeah, absolutely. 100% spices were part of it. Definitely. Yep. And what I meant by overseas was far away. Not that it necessarily came over the ocean, but that it came from very far away. It was not, piper was not being grown in the Mediterranean basin. That comes from Asia. Yep. I'm fine with cheese and meat and honey. Yeah, cheese and meat and honey is all really good. Don't say long pepper too much in curry. Yeah. Okay. So we've cut up our chicken. So let us move on to the next ingredient to prepare for our rummanah, our chicken with pomegranate juice. Okay, our pork fat now needs to also be prepared in some way. Our pork, they call it pork fat. That's a terrible translation. Fat back. The pork fat back needs to be prepared. So again, I don't have fat back because I wasn't able to locate it here in Daegu, South Korea, but we were able to get pork belly with the rind on, and that is a good close second. So now we just have to decide how much. And this is a ratios game. The difference between the fat back and this, there's a couple of differences, but the most important one is that the fat back would have been salt cured, and so it would be very salty. This is no salt at all. This is just pork belly with the rind on. So we don't have to be quite so careful about our ratio, but if you try this recipe with pork fat back, check out the sodium ratio. You might want to soak it a little bit, soak some of the salt out depending on how much sodium there is, or you might want to limit the amount of fat back that you're using. If I were using proper fat back, so for a whole chicken, this is about, I don't know, two kilograms worth of chicken. If I were to use this with the fat back, I would probably do maybe 3-4 ounces of fat back. Yeah. So I'm just going to try to, I actually have a scale. I don't know why I was hand weighing it. I have a digital scale. It's not, I mean, I could try to hand weigh it, and I have generally a pretty good sense. This is a digital scale. This is a modern scale. I am in the market for a replica medieval balance scale. So if any of you know of any replicas of, 13th through 15th century balance scales, let me know. I'm definitely interested in purchasing. Okay, so we're going to go with maybe not that much. Yeah, we're going to go with 300 grams of pork belly, rind on. Again, if I were using fat back, I would probably be using less because of the salt content. You know what? I'm going to stick to less. So 3 ounces would be, yeah, we're going to go with 150. We're going to go with 150 grams of our pork belly. So I don't want the pork belly should not be an overwhelming part of this. I'm convinced it was about seasoning it with the fat back, and also some of the benefits, the flavor enhancing benefits thereof. Pork fat back is also naturally sweet. It also, because pork is, and also the collagen in the fat back would be a really important component to this dish, I feel like, to the final outcome of texture. Yeah. Okay, so I've just basically, it was already sliced lengthwise, like big giant bacon rashers basically, which is how it comes here in Korea for barbecue purposes, for Korean barbecue purposes. And I've basically just chopped that into 1 centimeter slices. And that's what we're gonna go with. That's an assumption. That's an assumption. There is nothing in this recipe to indicate that the fat back is processed in any way, but I feel like it should be chopped smaller. So we're gonna go with that. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and have us prepare the almond milk, because the almond milk is going to take some time. The almond, once this starts cooking, it's going to go pretty quickly. So the almond milk is going to take some time. So let's talk about our pomegranate almond milk. Yes, you heard me right, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to make pomegranate juice almond milk. Life is beautiful, isn't it? Okay, checking for questions also. A weird question, but European people use acorns as a food source? Yes. Yeah, so acorns were used. Acorns were used. Oh, I'm not wearing an apron. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, guys. I hope I subconsciously wipe my hands on my apron, so I hope I didn't assume I was wearing an apron. Oh well. Yes, acorns were used, but they were used by poor people. Acorn was poor person food, and it was especially used in times of famine. But they did figure out that to consume, and acorns were not used in cooking, as far as I can tell. They were used to make bread, poor person bread. It was a very dense brick-like bread. So acorns, to use acorns for flour, you have to soak the acorns over like a period of 7 weeks, from what I've read, changing the water once a week or more, depending on how cold it is. And that's because the tannins are toxic. So it's a long process to process acorns into something that is non-toxic and edible. But it seems that it was used specifically to make bread in times, especially in times of famine, or by the especially hard on their luck. So was it used in upper class food? No, it was a poor person food. It was also literally pig food. The pig farmers would take their pigs out to graze in the forest to eat the acorns off of the forest floor. So you have to be in a really tough spot in medieval Europe to eat acorns. That's a good question. Yeah. Who is out there putting corn on pizza? Yeah, me too. 100%. Yeah, the tannins in the acorns, they are so toxic. So like I said, 7 weeks to soak the tannins out. And I have always wondered, what poor bastard did that experiment? Like, who is it who tried it after 1 week and realized it wasn't enough and had very unfortunate outcomes? Who is it that tried it after 2 weeks and realized it still wasn't enough, and on and on and on until they realized 7 weeks was enough? I've always wondered about that process, but it is a clear sign of desperation if you are eating acorn flour or anything made of acorns. Yep. Yeah, acorns, don't eat acorns. Please don't eat acorns. Don't just eat them straight up. Don't do that. Bad juju. 7 weeks. 7 weeks from what I've read. I haven't experimented with it, but that's what I've read, that it takes a really long time to soak them out. Yeah, tapioca is the same. You don't just eat cassava root. Don't just eat cassava root either, guys. There are so many foodstuffs that really need a lot of processing for us to consume them, and I'm convinced that all of those foodstuffs come from a place, at their origins come from a place of desperation, because otherwise you don't mess around with something that, if you've got plenty of other foods, you're not going to bother with the one that is clearly toxic if you don't go through this elaborate processing. Yeah. tried a sip of acorn coffee once. Now, acorn coffee, I don't know. Maybe they'd done the 7 weeks of soaking. Huh? The guy that figured out that dairy cows must have been a weirdo. Yeah, yeah. I mean, dairy cows make sense. You see the calves drinking the milk. That's at least that's you know. But acorns, right? Okay, so we're going to be making almond milk from pomegranate. So here is the description. This almond milk is very interesting for several reasons. One, crush unskinned almonds. The skins are still on. Most almond milk recipes from the Middle Ages say to remove the skins. We're leaving the skins on, so that's interesting. Moisten it with the juice of sour pomegranates and sweet pomegranates. So I will confess that where I am, I was not able to get sour pomegranate juice. If you live in a community that has if you live in a community with an Iranian neighborhood or an Iranian grocery store, maybe in a good Asian grocery store with a really large selection, you might be able to get sour pomegranate juice also. If not, the trick is to take sweet pomegranate juice and add lemon juice. So I'm going to go ahead and change cutting boards. So for those who might not know, one of my techniques for getting maximum lemon juice out of a lemon is to abuse the lemon first by rolling it like this. It gets rolling on the top so that it breaks up all the pulp in advance and it makes it much easier to extract as much juice as possible. Now, I haven't seen what a medieval juicer might have looked like. They probably don't look like the modern metal ones very much though. This one I bought, and I don't know whether or not this is how they would have looked, but I bought this one in Thailand and it's handmade from wood. So we're going to use this one because at least it looks visually more like it should, I feel like. I'm going to use, this is going to be our cooking pot, by the way. This is a clay pot, a modern Korean clay pot. I would have liked to have used my, oh, we might be able to use it now that I've broken the, no, we might have to use both pots actually. This is a traditional Korean clay cooking pot that looks very much like medieval cooking pots. This is the modern version that's really pretty, right? For stoneware, for cooking right over the fire. So we're going to be using that today to try to replicate the cooking conditions as much as we can, given my constrictions here of not having an actual medieval kitchen with all of my replica medieval items. Okay, so we cut our lemon in half, like so. Just squeezes it out oh so nicely. Okay, so basically we're going to be mixing our lemon juice with our pomegranate juice, and that will hopefully give us the effect of sour pomegranate juice and sweet pomegranate juice. Got another lemon we'll add in because I want to make certain we're not being overly sweet. Okay, one more lemon. Oh, thank you. Thank you for those lovely gifts, everyone. Appreciate that. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a really cool one. The goat trophy. Love it. And gold coins. Thank you, Michi. I really appreciate that. Seeing the lemon made me wonder if scurvy was widespread in the Middle Ages. It doesn't seem to have been. Because you can get vitamin C from a lot of different things. People don't realize how much vitamin C there is in a lot of greens, for instance. So yeah, scurvy does not seem to have been common in the Middle Ages. Not looking at the skeletal record, it's not very prevalent. Even if you look at graveyards where there's a lot of commoners, for instance, or people who should, by all rights, maybe have scurvy. Yeah, thankfully, if you eat a very well-balanced, rich diet with a lot of different vegetables, which, believe it or not, people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum did, you won't get scurvy. And I'll say this, I know many of you have heard me say this before, I'll say it again. It's ironic but true that the people on the lower end of the economic spectrum actually ate a more nutritionally dense diet than people at the upper echelons, because people at the lower end were eating a lot of root vegetables. They were eating whole grain sourdough bread, not made from wheat, but made from much more nutritionally dense grains such as rye and millet and spelt. They were, but especially rye, which also has a lower glycemic index, which also has less gluten in it, which also has fewer anti-nutrients in it. And they were eating all kinds of seasonal greens, herbs, lots and lots of herbs, lots and lots of bitter grains that, you know, people on the upper end of the echelon probably wouldn't have enjoyed. But it's what they could afford because it was generally free. They could go scavenge for it. So people on the lower end of the economic spectrum in medieval Europe were generally eating a better, healthier diet than their so-called betters. Yeah, I know that's hard for a lot of people to accept. And meta studies have been done across Europe that show that the lower bottom 80% of the socioeconomic spectrum in medieval Europe ate an average of 32 kilograms of meat a year. By the 19th century in Europe, that average had dropped to 19. So medieval peasants also had better access to animal protein than people in the 19th century did, which shows that human progress is not a linear function, and that just because something came before doesn't mean it was worse or that the conditions were worse than they are to a time and a place that comes after. Okay, our lemon juice, nice and squeezed. So, almonds. So one of the things that this recipe about which it said nothing was soaking them in advance. It didn't say that, but I know that if you are going to make almond milk this way in particular, or any way, honestly, it's much better if they are soft. So I soaked these in multiple changes of water for many days. And some recipes for almond milk say to do that. They say to soak them overnight or soak them over several days, changing the water every time. And they might not have understood why that made the almonds more digestible, but by doing so, almonds are a seed. If you soak them in water overnight or for multiple days, it will start the sprouting process. They will start to germinate, and that will actually kill the anti-nutrients, the phytonutrients that are within and outside of the almond, and turn them into nutrients that your body can absorb. Phytonutrients, not only will your body not absorb them, they will actually take nutrients from your intestines out with them on the way to becoming feces. So the process of soaking grains and nuts and beans is very important because it destroys the phytonutrients or reduces the content anyway. So I soaked these over several days, especially because we're leaving the skin on, even though we're not going to be actually eating the almond mash itself. So they're soft, they've been soaked. Now, the other thing that it doesn't say anything about is chopping these up to start with. So let me just show you first off our giant mortar. I bought this in Thailand. It's wood, hand turned. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? And my Thai friends told me they don't oil it. They don't put any kind of finish on the inside. They just use it. So I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go for it. I did wash it, but I haven't, it doesn't have any epoxy or anything like that. And my Thai friends say they don't do that with theirs. And I now have 2 giant pestles that I can use. So I'm going to actually 2-fist this because it goes faster. And I need to get a pad. If you're using a mortar and pestle, or mortar, pestle also, you really want to put padding underneath of it, especially if you're working on a modern surface, because you want it to absorb the vibrations, especially if you live in an apartment like I do. I don't want my downstairs neighbors to hate me on a Sunday. So one of the other techniques when you use a mortar when you process this is the food processor of the Middle Ages, by the way. They didn't have grinders. They had grinding stones, but they didn't use them for meat. So they didn't have for grinding meat, for instance. You didn't grind meat. You use knives to mince it. So this is one of the key food processing tools in a medieval kitchen, the mortar and the pestle. And I do actually have an antique full-size pestle that would be used in this. The full-size pestle, Ryan's not here, so he can't hand it to me. They're huge. They're really big. And you actually put the mortar on the ground and you stand and you bring the full weight of your body to bear with the pestle, right? So we have just kind of the mini pestle. Yeah, we have the mini large pestle that we'll be using, and I'm putting it on multiple layers of padding so that hopefully it minimizes the vibrations being transmitted to my long-suffering neighbors. So we have here our almonds, and the recipe says to crush the almonds and moisten them with the juice. Oh yeah. Right. This is a proper sized pestle. The reason I'm not using this is because this is an antique one and it's cracked on the end and we need to seal it before we actually start using it on foodstuffs, right? But this just imagine how quickly it goes if you're using something this heavy. This thing weighs 10 pounds, at least 15. Probably 15 pounds, right? So yeah, it would go really quickly if you have a 15-pound pestle and gravity working with you, right?
Do you want these?
Oh, those were I wondered where they were. These are better. These are actually hand felted wool heat pads that we got in Mongolia. Okay, so the recipe does not say to actually chop the almonds in advance, so I'm going to actually go with that. We're just going to put some of these in here. And, you know, again, there's no quantities. There's no discussion of how much almonds should be utilized to make this pomegranate juice almond milk. There's also no discussion about how much pomegranate juice. So usually the ratio, though, is 2 to 1. That is usually the ratio. Oh, we're going to be turning. I just realized we're going to be using my cheesecloth to strain this. It's going to be turned bright red by the pomegranate juice. So first I'm going to, because these have soaked already, I'm going to go ahead and do an initial crushing. Oh wait, I said I was going to do this two-handed. Okay, so first we're going to do an initial crushing. And then I will add a little bit of pomegranate juice at a time to moisten it, as it says. And then at the end, when it's really getting more and more crushed, I will add more of the pomegranate juice and also some of the lemon juice. So in we put some of the lemon juice and some of the pomegranate juice. Oh yeah, that's going to stain my smock. Oh boy.
I'm going to the gym.
Have fun. Yeah, it's okay. So, things to think about with the pomegranate juice. It's going to splatter. So definitely don't put in a lot of pomegranate juice at first. Oh boy, I might actually have to put up the whole apron. Normally I just wear the waist part of the apron because they didn't actually wear aprons that covered their upper body. But here's the thing, if I were doing this the medieval way, this would be on the ground and nowhere near my torso. So it would matter a lot less. But right now it's very near my torso. And I really don't want pomegranate juice all over, pomegranate spatters all over my smock. Okay, sorry about this, everyone. When one needs must, one needs must. Protect myself as much as possible. Okay. Oh, that's my Arab delivery. Wow.
Persian limes.
Yay.
Very good.
And what I'm going to see if I can raise this so you can get a better view into the pestle. Okay, there we go. Yep. So because the almonds have been soaked for multiple days, they are very soft and they smush pretty easily, actually. I'm at this point more concerned about the splattering of the pomegranate juice than the almonds are crushing easily. It's the pomegranate juice that is limiting my range of motion to not overly violent. Okay, hold on, let me just check questions. Let me see. I presume the almonds have been chucked, deshelled prior to this stage. Oh yes, Brian, yes, that's a good question. Yes, so there are no more shells. These are shucked almonds. They still have their skins on, but the shells have been removed. You are correct. Yeah. Yeah, trying to do this with the shells on. Oh, that would be nightmarish. Why is your smock covered in lots of pink dots? Well, I was making this medieval Sicilian chicken dish. So this rummanah, this chicken pomegranate dish, is found, this kind of dish is found in Andalusia, in Al-Andalus in this era, in the Caliphate. It's found in what is now like Lebanon and Syria, and at least as far as what was Persia at this time, what's now Iran. Right, so it is a very popular dish, and with good reason. Now, the modern Fesanjan doesn't use pomegranate juice, it uses pomegranate syrup, so it sort of actually circumvents it, which is basically all pomegranate molasses. All pomegranate molasses is pomegranate juice that has been cooked down over a low heat until it achieves more or less a molasses consistency. So I suspect that will kind of happen as part of the cooking process. Now, the thing about this recipe, lacking the timings, is that we have to consider how long this should cook. I personally plan on cooking it until it cooks down to a nice and thick stew. That's my plan. Yes, I can feel the splatters of pomegranate juice hitting my face. Fantastic. Yeah, almonds have a woody looking shell. It is not great. It would be nightmarish for crushing almonds that way in this manner. Definitely pre-shucked. And yes, if you want a good upper body workout, honestly, using a mortar and pestle is a pretty great way to accomplish it. I'll probably feel this tomorrow. I haven't done a lot of mortaring and pestling these last couple of weeks. So let's see. I've had some interesting questions in the comments under some of my recent videos. I recently published a video about medieval chimneys and how medieval chimneys started off, didn't really even get introduced into Europe until the 12th century, believe it or not, and were at first a luxury item, and that most homes didn't have chimneys until the 17th century. Which is also maybe hard to believe, but it's true. Most homes did not have chimneys until the 17th century in Europe. And so what that meant is most homes were smoky. They were, there would have been soot in the air. It would have been an environment that would have led to, wow, we just caused something to shift in here and fall under the cabinet from the vibrations. So that would have meant that if your hair was exposed and you lived in that kind of home, your hair would end up very dirty very quickly, because smoky air is not just something that's hard to breathe. Smoky air has greasy soot in it, and that will cling to your hair really nicely. So I I have this theory that as chimneys spread across Europe and society, they started basically in Italy. And by the 14th century, it seems that most homes in Italy have chimneys. And then that sort of spread slowly to north of the Alps. And then castles and palaces started getting retrofitted with chimneys. In the 15th century, that process is still ongoing. We have expense accounts from dukes' households, John Howard, for instance, where it actually specifies that they are adding chimney pieces to the hall of a property. So even the wealthiest of wealthy in 15th century England are just starting to get chimneys in their homes. Tells you how much of a luxury it was, right? So my theory is that if you also then look at the styles, the way that women and men, in fact, styled their hair or covered their hair, you'll notice that as the centuries wear on, and the further north you, from south to north, women start uncovering their hair and doing hairstyles instead of keeping their hair hidden under kerchiefs and veils. So by the 16th century, by the second half of the 16th century, in most parts of Europe, women are just flaunting their hair. I mean, their hair is coiffed, it's styled, it's not down, but you've got all this like fringe, really highly curled and styled and put into specific shapes and completely exposed with just a tiny little linen cap, sort of keeping it modest in quotes. And I think that has to do with the spread of chimneys. I really do. I think as homes got less and less smoky, women felt more and more comfortable not covering their hair because it meant their hair didn't become disgustingly dirty within a day. And so the question was, does that mean, the comment was that this individual, one of my very loyal followers, had noticed in manuscript illuminations from certain places in the 12th and the 14th century that women wore their hair loose or were in braids and visible, and that there were statutes that talked about women, the kind of braids women could have, or whether they could use certain kinds of ribbons, etc. And did that mean then that those women had chimneys? As always, the answer is more complicated than one might think. First off, the art. Let's talk about medieval art. Medieval art is not trustworthy as an accurate representation of the way people actually dressed or did their hair, because you have to understand what it is that piece of medieval art is actually depicting. So you can't just take like Pinterest is nightmarish for this, right? Pinterest, there are all these Pinterest boards covered in medieval art under the heading of 15th century clothing or 13th century hairstyles. But the problem is that they almost never, ever actually label the source of that picture. And so you think it's just a picture of a real person, perhaps, but it's not. It's the depiction of Bathsheba or Judith from the Old Testament, or Eve, or, the Empress Claudia, or it could be allegory of reason or grammar. Everyone, apparently YouTube decided to just recycle the live stream. It usually does this right about the 2-hour mark. So yeah, you can't just take art at face value. You have to understand what it is that picture is depicting, who it is. And especially if you're depicting women from Arthurian romances, those are fantasy women. Those are not real women. So they're nearly always depicted in a way that the illuminator would imagine that these fantasy women would have been depicted. They're not necessarily emblematic or representative of what real women wore or how they did their hair. So you can't just trust that. What you can trust nearly always is inventories. Expense accounts, inventories, wills, court cases. If you look at court cases, they often end up describing the clothing that people, men and women, are wearing and how their hair was done, because it's often somehow relevant to the case, especially in the case of sexual assault, for instance. And also, there even before the proliferation of chimneys, there were times when women might actually style their hair in some neat style and not cover it. Specifically, festivals, feasts, special occasions. But that isn't necessarily indicative of how they were dressing or covering themselves always. And so, but those laws could be in place, those statutes could be in place because it was, they didn't like what women were doing at those festivals and those public occasions. And especially festivals tended to be out of doors where the whole chimney thing is irrelevant anyway. So yeah, that's my answer. That's my answer to do depictions of women with exposed hairstyles equal the presence of chimneys? In short, no. But also you can't trust those depictions. You have to understand the context. Especially when it's allegorical. Allegories are very rarely represent an accurate depiction of real women because they wanted the viewer to know this isn't a real woman. This is an allegory of grammatica or matematica or rhetorica, right? Okay. I'll show you how things are looking here. Getting nice and mashy. That's an adjective I just invented. Ooh, humidity. If you see little droplets of glistening moisture trailing down my face, it's because the humidity has skyrocketed because the monsoons are here. We're in Daegu, South Korea, for those who aren't familiar with our current location. And also, if you're just joining, welcome to my medieval cooking party. Today we are making a Sicilian dish from the 13th century that shows clear origins in the Middle East, pomegranate chicken. And here in Daegu, South Korea, we are commencing monsoon season, and it looks like we might actually get rain this year for monsoon season. I'm so excited because if it doesn't rain during monsoon season in Korea, it's just blisteringly hot, unpleasantly, stiflingly hot. And while I can tolerate it, I would rather it not be. I would definitely prefer it to be, temperatures in the mid to upper 20s with some nice rain than for temperatures to be in the upper 30s to low 40s and no rain. Sorry, speaking in centigrade, for those who are wondering why I'm quoting such low numbers for the summer. And if you're enjoying, don't forget to like and subscribe, everyone. So I like to really mash my my almonds for the almond milk until it's, every single almond has been crushed. And again, if I could actually do this on the ground with that giant pestle that I demonstrated earlier, this would go real fast. And that is how it would have worked. In a medieval kitchen, in a professional kitchen, which is the kind of kitchen in which this dish would have been prepared, there would have been someone who would have, especially the royal house of Anjou in Sicily, in Salerno, which this very clearly connects to that, this recipe. There would have been someone probably whose sole job it was to process food like this. All they did all day, every day was crush stuff in a mortar with a giant pestle. And that was, part of their remuneration package, a total body workout. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Okay, let me just check the questions. Yeah, we get monsoon in the continental states nowadays. Yeah. So, yeah. Rule of cool for the artists. Yep, 100%. Okay, just checking back through our... Yeah, okay. And if you all have any questions about medieval cuisine, about daily life in the Middle Ages, or medieval culture, feel free to pop them in the live chat, and I will get to them as I can. Yeah, the weather patterns are changing, and that's one of the reasons the monsoon season has been dying here, because we're no longer getting the rains that we should get. And that's a problem in Korea, because Korea's ecology relies on the monsoon rains. They really do. They also rely on snow in the winter, which we're no longer getting. So instead, in the winter, it's just bitterly, bitterly dry and sort of cold depending on where you are. And then in the summer, it's blisteringly hot, but not a lot of rain. That has been leading to wildfire issues. It's very problematic. Smush. Smush, all of you. Smush, damn it. Okay, so now that we've got them all crushed more or less, adding some more pomegranate juice in. So I like to add this in a bit at a time when I'm doing it with a mortar and pestle, because I don't want it to, become a soup. I want the almond mash to sort of incorporate or emulsify with the pomegranate juice so that you get more of the almond out of the almonds, so to say. Right? If I were to just pour all of that juice in at once, it would be a slushy mess and it would be very hard to work with. But adding it in a bit at a time, that really seems to be the magic yes for having great outcomes with almond milk. And as I said, medieval almond milk is 2-to-1 water to almonds. So 2 times almonds to 2 times water to 1 times almonds. So it's a pretty heavy ratio. It's not like the almond milk you generally get, and there were no thickeners added to the almond milk, but some recipes will thicken the dish. So there were medieval thickeners. Medieval thickeners in general, in medieval Europe, thickeners included, believe it or not, rice flour. Rice flour is of the dust, the powder thickeners. Rice flour is the most common, and I know that probably surprises a lot of you. Bread, though, stale bread or bread crumbs, instead of wheat flour, they would actually use stale bread or bread crumbs for thickening a lot of things as well. Egg yolk immersion was also a common method of medieval thickening. So one of the recipe right next to this one in the Liber de Coquina is limonia, lemon chicken, and it actually suggests using egg yolks to thicken the broth. So egg yolk emulsion is a method. Okay. Trying to think of any other starches or flours that I've seen for thickening. I can't think of any offhand. That doesn't mean anything because there are literally thousands of recipes that have actually survived from the Middle Ages. And even if could be 20 to 30 versions of the same recipe, those different versions each have minor differences that in some cases are not so minor. So it's just like now there's at least 30 different ways to make pancakes, American style fluffy buttermilk pancakes. There's just as many ways to make, pernolte, which is a kind of pasty pie from the 15th century. Or blancmange, God knows, blancmange, chicken and rice. That dish is ubiquitous across medieval Europe, and everyone has their own take on it. Okay. And according to the recipe, see, I knew it. I knew. One tiny little piece of pomegranate almond with pomegranate juice on it just flew out of that mortar and landed right on the white collar of my smock. How likely is that to happen? Seriously. There's all this target space and this tiny little almond with pomegranate juice landed right there. God. Tell me I don't have gremlins again. Oh, wait, sorry, missed some questions. Apologies. What are you cooking? And where did you buy that giant mortar and pestle? Yes, so thank you so much for answering that, Cassandra, but I will answer it for anyone watching this as a recording. Yeah, so we are cooking pomegranate chicken from a 13th century Sicilian cookbook. So southern Italy now, as would be now, but was its own kingdom at the time. This recipe is very reflective of Middle Eastern dishes, pomegranate chicken dishes like Persian Fesanjan. And this giant mortar I bought in Thailand in May, a couple of weeks ago, and we brought it back with us as a carry-on. So yeah. And we also have a giant granite mortar, but I wanted to try out the new wooden mortar that we have. Wow, that almond just does not want to crush. There we go. Okay. So you can see how our pomegranate almond mash is coming along. Oh, wow. Thank you. Michi, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay. So this is going to be a very interesting almond milk because it's almond milk made with pomegranate juice, and it should be both sour and sweet pomegranate juice, but I wasn't able to procure sour pomegranate juice, only the sweet. So therefore, I've been adding lemon juice in place of the sour pomegranate juice. Right. Now, the acid in both the pomegranate juice and I'm going to use a modern implement. I apologize, everyone. The acid in both the lemon juice and the pomegranate juice should actually help tenderize our chicken as it cooks. But the heating will also denature the acid as it goes along, so the effect might be somewhat minimal. And in the modern version of this recipe from Persia, they don't use almonds. You basically make walnut milk, but not with pomegranate juice. You just straight up make an almond milk or a walnut milk. And then the walnuts are actually cooked in it. But this recipe actually says to strain the almonds out. In fact, most recipes involving almond milk in medieval Europe strain the almonds out. And there's been a long discussion, well, what on earth do you do with that mash? Right? So because nothing was wasted in food-wise in medieval Europe. Nothing. Everything was used food-wise. So if they didn't use it for their own recipes, some people suggested, well, that could be fed to the pigs. Yeah, granted, almond-fed pigs, why not? But, it just seems to me that there could be something else to be used for it. And someone mentioned, I think it's a 15th century Catalan recipe that actually uses the almond mash left over from almond milk to make a kind of custard. And I've been trying to track that recipe down. So if any of you know the recipe of which I'm talking and its source, let me know. It's a recipe, I think it's 15th century Catalan, but it could be somewhere else in medieval Europe, that actually utilizes the almond mash, that specifies to use the almonds that are left over from making almond milk. I have found a use for all of those egg whites that generally get sifted out of a lot of pie recipes, because a lot of medieval egg tart recipes use just the yolks. Sensible, because the yolks are the flavor part. So I have found uses for those egg whites. I'm still in the quest to actually find the recipe that utilizes the crushed almonds from making almond milk. And again, this is a gorgeous replica of a 15th century Italian water and wine flask made by Historic Glassworks. No, they're not a channel sponsor. Armor and Castings is a channel sponsor, but not Historical Glassworks. But the interesting thing about medieval glassware like this is I should have a exact match, a companion, and one would have wine, which kind of looks like this. The other would have water, and the servants, the people serving the wine would actually mix the wine for you, because medieval people did not drink undiluted wine. They just didn't. At the very least, it was half and half water, half wine. And if not that, then it was some particularly temperate people like Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, drank it 1 to 3. So 1 part wine, 3 parts water. Okay, a little bit more. Okay, here's what our slurry looks like currently. Let me just check the comments. Let me see. Are there different kinds of pomegranate for sweet and sour juice? Yes, there are actually sour pomegranates and sweet pomegranates. Now, the question is whether it's a different cultivar. I think it might be a different cultivar, like sour oranges are not just unripe oranges. I think it is a different cultivar. I think they never get sweet, the sour pomegranates. So I'm pretty certain that is the case, because actually Taquinum sanitatis shows a sour pomegranate tree. in that health manual I talked about for actually looking at to see how medieval foodstuffs and other items from daily life looked. Yeah, there's actually one of the entries is sour pomegranate tree. So I'm pretty certain that it is a different cultivar than the sweet pomegranate. It never gets sweet, but it's not like have any of you had sour pomegranate juice or sour pomegranates? I actually haven't. I've been trying to get my hands on it to see just how sour it really is. For example, sour cherries to me aren't really that sour. So, yeah. Would marzipan use the almond mash? No. The almond mash has no flavor. It doesn't have a lot of flavor left to it. So it would make a very nasty marzipan. It would not make a good marzipan. I mean, I guess you could dry it out, but you've also extracted a lot of the fat from it too. So I don't think it would make very good marzipan. I think it would be terrible marzipan, actually. Michia says sour pomegranates are slightly more sour than sour cherries, but not drastically. Okay, so we're not talking, because sour oranges are sour. Sour oranges are the same as lemons, basically, in terms of sourness, not flavor profile, but level of sour. Oh, and I should mention something about medieval recipes for almond milk are very, very basic. Just like many of the recipes in medieval cookbooks or recipe collections, they don't provide all the details. They assume a lot of prior knowledge. If you were to have followed this recipe exactly like it says, crush the almonds, add pomegranate juice, and strain it, you would not get almond milk. You would get pomegranate juice. So you really have to, there's a lot of, as I've said this before, I'll say it again, medieval recipes assume a lot of knowledge on your part. A lot of prior knowledge on your part. And the making of almond milk, I'm pretty certain, was handled by one person in most medieval kitchens of this type. Right? There was someone who specialized in making almond milk. That was their job all day, every day. Like there was a pastry chef. All their job was to make pastry for pies and pasta. Same job, same person did that. So yeah, you really have to, you do have to come with some foreknowledge to successfully execute these recipes. Which is probably why some of you have heard me talk about that snarky book from 100 years ago written by an English academic about the horrors of medieval cuisine. I think he calls it the Medieval English Feast. I think that's what it's called. And he has almost nothing good to say about medieval English food. Based on the original recipes. And I think that's because if they tried making them, I'm going to assume they tried making them exactly as described, which would result in a disaster almost every time. I can't even imagine. Could you imagine just tossing in a whole chicken, a whole chunk of fat back, and a whole onion into a pot and hoping it turns out well? Yeah, Michia, I love sour things too. I'm a sour person. Tamarind for me, unsweetened, just fresh, normal tamarind with the seeds still in it. I pick them out. I eat that like it's candy, because to me it's sweet enough to be candy. Most people can't handle sour tamarind. I love sour tamarind. So good. Nature's Sour Patch Kids. Yeah, I love sour things too. I hate it. I hate it when can we please talk about dried fruit, everyone, for a moment? Stop adding sugar to dried fruit. Mango, strawberries, blueberries, cherries, apples, none of them need sugar added to them when you dry them, because when you dry them, you're already concentrating their natural sugars. Please stop doing that, food manufacturers. Unnecessary. Actually, I'm really liking this one better for making the almond milk because it works better to crush. It gets a broader amount of coverage on the side of the bowl, because what I'm doing here is I'm actually, as I've been adding the almond milk, as I've been adding the pomegranate juice, I have been dragging the almonds against the side of the bowl, the crushed almonds against the side of the bowl to help extract their almond milkness into the pomegranate juice. Let's see if I can show you. Medieval spoon. Okay, let me show you. So this is a replica medieval spoon. Yeah, I'm just going to take a little taste. I will say, modern almonds compared to medieval almonds are not as almondy as the medieval ones would have been. There's actually some theories that they might have included a single bitter almond into the whole bunch of so-called sweet almonds, because the bitter almond is actually where this almond flavor is. And I know some of you are going to say bitter almonds have cyanide in them. Yes, but apparently if you just have one little bitter almond in a whole like 2 or 3 pounds of sweet almonds, it's not a toxic amount of cyanide. And other weird things I've said. I say apparently because I haven't looked into it that deeply, nor do I plan to try it myself. But that is what I have read. Not a toxic amount of cyanide. Crazy, another crazy things I say in this show. Oh, thank you for joining us from Russia. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we're just making pomegranate almond milk the medieval way. We are working today on a pomegranate chicken recipe called rummanah. Comes from the Arabic word rumman, which means, or rummanah, which means pomegranate. And the dish itself seems to come from the Middle East, at the very least from what is now Syria or Palestine, or Jordan, but possibly also all the way from modern day Iran, from what then would have been called Persia, related very heavily, very closely to the dish chicken fesanjan. Right. Oh, by the way, for those of you who like Persian cuisine, chicken fesanjan was originally made with duck rather than chicken, like back in the height of the Persian Empire in the Middle Ages. Well, which Persian Empire, I guess? In the Middle Ages, anyway. Apparently, it was originally made with duck, which I think duck fesanjan would be super, super yummy. Now, I'm actually going to incorporate all of this pomegranate juice into this because it's going to cook down a lot. And I'm thinking of it from the Fesanjan perspective. Really? Thinking of it from the chicken Fesanjan perspective of normally I would be making this with pomegranate molasses if it was the Persian dish. And that would actually be quite a lot of pomegranate juice to then cook down. And I'm hoping to get the same effect here where we cook it down quite a lot until we get a nice thick stew-like consistency. So my plan is to incorporate all of this pomegranate juice into here. Which actually, this thing fits quite a lot. You wouldn't believe how much actually fits in here. And then the next step is actually going to be to strain it through a cheesecloth. Now it says to just strain it. And there's a lot of debate about what kind of strainer would have been used. The kinds of strainers that would have been available in 13th century Sicily, I'm actually not as familiar with. I wasn't able to find a lot of information about 13th century Sicilian kitchen implements. I know it was available in the 15th century across Italy, though. There were different kinds of strainers and sieves and colanders. There were pottery ones, there were ceramic ones. That wouldn't be useful for this. There were horsehair ones. They were actually called hair sieves in medieval English, 14th, 15th, I think 13th century actually, 13th, 14th, 15th century English. They were called hair sieves, and they would have been made with horsehair, and that would have been a very fine mesh. So it's possible that could have been used to strain this as well, but you could also just use a piece of linen, which is what we have here, my cheesecloth. It it got colored by, used it to strain parsley recently, so now it has a big green stain in the middle of it, but that's fine. It's been washed. It's just permanently dyed green now, apparently. So there would have been different options. And I don't think I've ever found a medieval source that specifically says use a cloth to strain the almond milk. Now, that doesn't mean it's not out there. I just haven't personally seen it. So if you have seen a medieval source that gets really specific about how to strain the almond milk, do let me know. I'm always, that's one of the reasons I love studying history. It's not great man history. I love daily life history. I love understanding how people did everything in their daily lives, how the things that were different from the way we do them, the things that are similar from the way we do them. That's what really fascinates me. Yeah, there was a battle in 1066 in England, whatever. What was their morning like? Like, what did they do? How did they get up? Did they clean their teeth and wash their feet and hands and body the way it says to do in the health manuals? Or did they actually do something else? What was their actual life like before they went and slaughtered each other? That interests me. The slaughtering each other part, I fall asleep during battle scenes in most movies, so I guess that should tell you what I think of that. Just gonna let those rest in our cooking pot while I scrape. And no, they didn't have rubber scrapers. I am cheating here. The tactile thing, probably they would have used their fingers. I don't like that sensation at all. No, thank you. I'm good. What they wouldn't have done is waste. Waste in a medieval kitchen and in a pre-industrial revolution world is very minimal. Circular economy for the win. Okay, so here is our pomegranate almond juice. And I don't have a horsehair. I don't have a hair sieve here, alas. I have a wire strainer. So I'm going to actually put that underneath of our cheesecloth. It's actually it's not really cheesecloth. It's just a piece of relatively fine linen. This gets out all of everything when I strain the almond milk, and it's strong enough that I can give it a good squeeze. So put this here. Angle it down. Why do you think modern almonds taste less almondy? Why do I think that, or why might they taste less almondy? Because why they might is because things generally are bred. Cultivars of all foodstuffs, fruits, vegetables, even animals, they have been, in the West in particular, they have been selectively bred so that you maximize output and quantity and resistance to drought and other elements, and that the process of choosing for those traits usually comes at the cost of flavor, usually. So, it is very, as far as we can tell, just like heirloom tomatoes taste better than the factory farmed mass-produced ones or massively grown monoculture ones, it is probable, very highly probable, that medieval fruits and vegetables tasted more strongly, and in some cases maybe better, maybe not, but yeah, that seems to be the general trend. That we breed things to be monstrously huge rather than, to taste good or to have good dense micronutrition or even good macronutrition. So that's why I suspect that medieval sweet almonds may have had more of an almond flavor to them than the almonds that we can commonly get now do. Obviously, I've never tasted an actual medieval almond, so I don't know. But that kind of would line up with what I know about the way cultivars have evolved or devolved since the Middle Ages. Yeah. Why? Yeah, dosage does matter, Michio, 100%. In fact, I did find a fellow medievalist had actually reconstructed a marzipan recipe, and they actually did include a bitter almond in their marzipan because they wanted it to taste like almonds. They also said if you're not comfortable including the bitter almond, then you can get some almond extract, which is made from bitter almonds because that's where almond flavor resides. Sweet almonds just don't have it. And that's something else, that fruits and vegetables have generally been bred to be less toxic than they once were. And that's true of potatoes. You know, potatoes used to be terribly toxic thousands of years ago when humans first started trying to force them into food shapes. And in the Andes, they came up with really brilliant ways of coping with it. One, they started selectively breeding them so that these, is it cyanotoxins? It might be cyanotoxins. No, there's a different toxin. I'm blanking on the name of the toxin that is commonly found in potatoes. The one that makes them look green. But that used to be like a key, it used to be most of the potato. And they started selectively breeding them to reduce that. But then they also came up with taco, which is this edible clay in which they would basically coat them. And the clay, eating them together, it's tasty. It's like a sauce, basically. You dip it in the sauce and you eat the potato. And the clay basically acts like activated carbon in your system. And it absorbs the toxins and you just excrete them out on the other end, all safe and sound. So yeah, humans have been, modifying, having massive impacts on our environment for eons, really, at this point. See? Okay. Wow, it's turning it a very pretty color. Oh, goodness. Okay. Okay, I'm going to pour the rest of the almond paste in here, hopefully. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? This is really small. I'm going to get the bigger sieve. Or not. The bigger sieve has gone on walkabout. Okay. Someone got creative when they put away dishes and put the bigger sieve somewhere where I would probably never find it. Okay. Right. So much for that plan. Okay. Well, we'll just have to keep working in small amounts. Ryan, where did you put the bigger sieve? You keep putting it in some place I will never find it. Ugh. Okay, I did find it. Okay, I'm going to let this actually drain passively while I get started with the rest of the recipe. I miss having my replica medieval bowls. Okay. Anyway, you can see, get a good idea of what pomegranate almond milk looks like. Nice. There we go. I'm going to let gravity do its thing. I'm going to have to get some stain stick for this smock. It's now covered in pomegranate spatters. Set this to drain off to the side while we get started on the rest of the recipe. Okay, so from here, back to our recipe. And for those just joining, welcome to my medieval cooking party. I am the Contessa of the Creative Contessa. My mission is to spread the joy of historical creativity of all kinds throughout the world. My main focus is mostly the medieval world, not just Europe though. And but I do explore other eras as well. So to make rummanah, fry the chickens with pork fatback and onions. So we're at that stage because we already did the unskinned almonds, crushed them, moistened them with juice of sour and sweet pomegranates, and then straining it as we speak. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual cooking of the chicken. Right. So I wanted to use clay pots. Neither of my clay pots are particularly big, so we're going to use both of them to cook all of the chicken at once, because this was our chicken. And again, the recipe kind of implies that you should toss it all in there at once, but I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to do this in stages. I am actually going to put the fat back, which is actually just pork belly with rind on. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the pot. Oh, whatever. I'm going to leave it in. I'm going to put that in the pots. And I'm going to let that start rendering, and then I'll add the onions. These steps are not specified in the original recipe. And for those just joining, I explained this, I'll explain it again. It is highly likely they were intentionally left out, because none of these recipe collections are intended to be a full step-by-step description. They're intended to be a, look what I can do for you, hire me, I'll be your head cook. But if you don't hire me and your cook tries this recipe and follows these steps, they will regret their life choices. So I'm pretty certain that that it is left to us as the cook to actually kind of unpick the puzzle of the out of order steps that have been provided. So I'm going ahead, I've added the pork fat back, which is in this case, as I said, just pork belly with rind on. I'm going to let that just the fat render out a little bit, and then I'm going to add our onions. And then we will add the chicken and fry the chicken with that all together once our onions get started a little bit, right? And it could be that we could just toss it all in and it might turn out fine, but my cooking instincts tell me, no, this should be done step by step. I don't know. What do you all think? Peroxide for the splatter. Yep. I usually do have some peroxide, but I don't know if I want to run and go get it right now. Osman Sara, I didn't understand what you were doing. Oh, Osman Sara, hello and welcome. So I've just finished making pomegranate juice almond milk. This is a 13th century Sicilian recipe. It's called rummanah, but it comes from the Arabic word rummanah, which means pomegranates. And it is related to all the various pomegranate chicken dishes from the Middle East, including chicken Fesanjan. So we've now put let me just clean up my, let me just put my knives in order. Get rid of all of the pieces that we no longer need. My butter dishes there. And let me angle this out. Oh, this did not get moved to some place where it wouldn't be visible. Okay. Angle on the cooking here. Yeah, okay, there we go. All right, so we have our two clay pots, well, one clay pot, one stone pot. And we are now in the process of rendering the fat out of the pork fat back. And this is a sign that this dish definitely was localized for Christian audiences, because in both in the Middle Ages, in both Judaism and in Islam, pork was, of course, a forbidden foodstuff. So this is clearly a sign of how common this dish must have been, that it actually was localized by the addition of the pork fat back to it. Yep. Let me see. Oh, Susan, okay, see you later. Have a lovely day. Yep, peroxide for the spatter. That's a good point. Wondering if I should go and peroxide it right now. I might do that. Okay. And some of you might be thinking, why are you not using a skillet? Well, one, medieval skillets generally didn't have sides. They were much more open affairs, more like a metal plate on a long metal arm than a skillet you might recognize today. So not very good for anything involving liquid, really. Two, after we fry this, we then add liquids to it. So it is absolutely possible to fry things in a pot. I know a lot of modern people don't get that in the West, especially, that you can pot fry things. You don't have to fry things in only a skillet. And I might decide to add a little bit more pork belly to this as we go along. Now, the big difference with me not having pork fat back is that pork fat back is a cured meat. It is cured in salt. And this pork belly is completely raw. It hasn't been cured. So we will therefore have to add salt on our own to help enhance the flavor. But in the original dish, they probably wouldn't have had to salt it at all because the pork fat back would have added all the salt you needed for flavor enhancement. A lot of medieval recipes don't say anything about salt, and so this leads to a big debate in the medieval culinary world, whether you should cook with salt or whether salt should only be served at table and then the diners should, salt the food themselves. The thing is that salt isn't just a flavor enhancer. Salt will impact the texture of your dish as it's cooking and will give you different outcomes depending on the kind of dish in question. So it's not always an issue of just flavor enhancement. You might need to add salt during the cooking to achieve certain chemical reactions and therefore textural effects or moisture effects. It's not just a flavor thing. And of course, salt that you add at the table will just kind of sit on the top, whereas if you cook with salt, then it gets absorbed throughout the whole dish. So it is actually a different flavor as well. We take in role play seriously too. Not role play, but medieval living history. If you've ever heard of reenactment, yeah, this is what this is basically. I am reenacting the cooking of a medieval recipe, sort of, because I don't have all of the medieval kitchen equipment and kitchen gear that I might like to have. Okay, the fat has rendered out. I'm just going to go ahead and divide my onions between these two pans. The other reason I almost have to cook the onions first is because cooking them will cause them to take up less space, and you may or may not have noticed, but my two little clay pots are pretty full. And so I am going to go ahead and add salt now, because the salt from the pork fat back would probably start coming in contact with the onions and impacting their rate of cooking. If you add salt to your onions when you are cooking them, it will accelerate the process at which they cook, because salt is hydrophilic, which means it likes water. And so it will draw the water out of the onions and cause your onions to break down and cook more quickly. Salt is also hydrophilic, in case you were wondering. The reason that salt rubs work to help moisturize meat is because, and this is why you need to do it for a minimum amount of time, usually overnight is best. A salt rub works in that it causes the water to be pulled out of the meat. The water then dissolves the salt, and then the meat reabsorbs the water that then has the salt in it. So that's how a dry salt rub works. Same principle for salt brining as well. Yeah, and also pork and onions create amazing flavors. Yep. How do you deal with lingual drift in your primary sources? I'm a pattern recognition person. That's a great question. Thank you for asking, Cassandra. How do I deal with linguistic drift in my primary sources? Pattern recognition is something I'm good at. So languages, I can just recognize the linguistic drift. It doesn't bother me. And because, especially when it comes to Romance languages and Germanic languages, I have an in-depth knowledge of so many of them that it's easy for me to just adjust automatically. Now the danger is not that the grammar the grammar is whatever. Pronunciation doesn't really impact your understanding of a text as you're reading it. The challenge can be making certain that you understand the difference between the modern term and the medieval term. Just because you have the same word in, say, 15th century English doesn't mean it has the same meaning. I'll give you a prime example. The word girdle, girdle. What do you all think a girdle is? Okay, not you medieval living historians who actually know what it is. Right. What do you think a girdle is? So when I was growing up, I'll give you an example. My grandmother, all my grandmothers, had girdles. To them, a girdle was underpants that basically acted a little bit like a corset, like Spanx, right? It was underpants that held their stomach in and kept their hips in a nice line and their upper thighs in a nice line. That was a girdle, right? And the girdle might have also, although without the underpants part, the girdle might have also actually had straps for stockings, right? A stocking girdle. But in 15th century English, girdle just means belt, and it's a belt that you wear on under your clothing or over your clothing, but mostly over your clothing, and men and women both wore them. Girdles were just belts. So that's a very important shift in the usage and meaning of that word. So I think the biggest challenge for anyone looking at original sources is to try to find a good old language dictionary, by which I mean find a Middle English to Modern English dictionary or a Middle French to Modern French dictionary, and they're out there. There is an online Middle English dictionary maintained by the University of Michigan, which is one of the world's premier centers for medieval European scholarship, interestingly. It's online. Look up Middle English Dictionary online and you'll find it. And it is fan-damn-tastic, because not only does it provide definitions of the words, it actually provides the primary sources, citations from the primary sources, showing you how the word was used in context. And then you can learn all kinds of things about the word itself. So if the word is girdle, you're going to learn all kinds of things about medieval girdles. You're going to learn about how much they cost, what they were made of, what kind of colors they were, what kind of fittings they had, who had them, right? So it's a fantastic source. The online Middle English Dictionary maintained by U Michigan. Fantastic. There's a French one also, Dictionnaire du français moyen français, right? Dictionnaire du moyen français. Fantastic, absolutely excellent for exploring. For the same reason, it's a little more clumsily laid out than the Middle English Dictionary, but it does exactly the same thing, where it provides primary source citations about the words so that you can understand how the words were actually used in their context. So yeah, that's one of the ways that I deal with the potential, the linguistic drift, as you refer to it. Yeah, it is pretty cool. What happens when you dry rub with brown sugar? The same thing happens. So that's a good question. What happens if you dry rub meat with brown sugar? The same thing happens as with salt. It's the same process. So the sugar is hydrophilic. So at first it pulls the water out of the meat, which means if you don't let it sit long enough with the dry rub, then you're going to end up with dry meat because it has pulled all the moisture out. But if you let that brown sugar dry rub sit long enough, if you let it sit overnight, for instance, then the sugar pulls out the water, and then the reverse thing happens. The water then the water then with the brown sugar dissolved into it redistributes throughout your meat. So, but if you have to let it sit long enough, or you will end up with dry meat. Salt, whether salt or sugar, it's the same thing. Okay, so we are, yeah. And the interesting thing is that this recipe does say to stir occasionally. Not all medieval recipes actually advise that. So it's nice when they give us any information. For those just joining, welcome to my medieval cooking party. I am the Contessa of the Creative Contessa. I am a medieval living historian, a reenactor, and a general enthusiast for exploring how people lived their daily lives in past eras. And so today we are doing a medieval cooking party in which we are exploring a 13th century Sicilian recipe that has Middle Eastern origins, pomegranate chicken. We have already made our pomegranate juice milk. How's that for a unique ingredient? Or rather, we're in the process of making it while we wait for our onions to cook down. And then we will be adding our onions and our pork belly or pork fat back if you have it. And then we will be adding our chicken pieces, sauteing them. And then we will add our pomegranate milk and we'll let it stew. Okay. While I'm going to continue squeezing out our pomegranate milk here. Pomegranate almond milk. So unlike chicken Fesanjan or duck Fesanjan, we are not going to actually use the almond mash in this recipe. It specifically says that it should be strained out. And so that is a big difference between the Middle Eastern versions of this dish. We're not cooking with the almonds, and that has always struck me as so very wasteful. But almonds don't get as soft when you cook them as walnuts do. And so I could actually see that might not be such a desirable texture to have in a stew as crushed walnuts could be. Oh, Gilles, thank you for joining us. Guillaume, bienvenue. Thank you for joining. Welcome to my channel. Yeah, so I have also been cooking. I do also represent many generations of cooking as well. My great-grandmother hand wrote family recipes into in this beautiful Palmer penmanship. She was born in 1900. And she hand wrote, I have childhood memories of watching her write these cookbooks. She actually hand wrote our family recipes into these spiral bound notebooks that my father still has. And I grew up using many of her recipes. She herself, I'm a product of many generations of immigrants from literally all over Europe. She was, amongst other things, she was Irish and Hungarian. And so there are a lot of Hungarian, Czech, and German recipes in her cookbooks that are no longer made that way in the Czech Republic, Hungary, or Germany, because her recipes represent a petrified moment from the end of the 19th century. That's how food was being cooked in those places at the end of the 19th century rather than the way those dishes are being made now. And my grandmother cooked, but my grandmother cooked mostly because she had to. My father cooked because he loved to. He learned to cook from his grandmother, my great-grandmother, and then I learned to cook from him. And I started helping him cook when I was stable enough to stand on a chair next to the counter and help him with things and next to the stove. Right. So yeah, cooking is a passion in my family. Feeding people is a passion in my family. I take it very seriously. I love making food for people. Even if I don't eat that kind of food, I will still happily make it for them. For instance, I stopped eating wheat more or less entirely. I cut it out of my diet and refined sugar, but I will still make people cupcakes and beautiful decorated cakes and cookies made the conventional way, because I know they like it, and I will happily make it for them. I just won't eat it myself. In fact, that's what my great-grandmother did. She developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 50, and she was a big pastry chef. She made her own phyllo dough from scratch. My great-grandmother made phyllo dough from scratch. She had a phyllo dough making table in her kitchen. If any of you have made phyllo dough, you'll appreciate that. She used to make all kinds of pastries and donuts, and she developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 50, and she never ate a single sweet thing again, but she kept making them for other people. She lived to be 89, despite having developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 50, right? That's pretty impressive. Yeah, Cooking is the thing to make people happy. Yep, I love making people happy with food. Yeah, so actually my great-grandmother, I think, actually left us 4 notebooks behind. And it is very interesting because I moved back to Germany. I immigrated to Germany when I was 22. And it was really interesting to see how these recipes have changed, how my great-grandmother's recipe for Apfelkuchen, for instance, or Flammkuchen is different from the way it's made now in minor ways, like the amount, and specifically in the amount of sugar, the ratio of sugar. Her Pflaumenkuchen has a lot less sugar than the modern German versions. Okay. So we're getting a little stickage here because the pork belly wasn't quite as fatty as I was anticipating it was going to be. If you ever have onions or anything sticking to a pan and it hasn't actually started burning yet, just add a little bit of water, or if your recipe has wine, you can deglaze your pan with wine, right? And you do want to do that occasionally because that stuff that's kind of slowly burning to the pan before it burns, that's flavor. That's Flavor Town, baby. You want that. You want that in your dish. But you want to get it before it blackens, before it carbonizes. So I've just added a little bit of water to my pans to loosen the bits that are sticking. And we're at the point now where we can go ahead and add our chicken and start frying. Now this is much easier to regulate heat on a modern gas stove than it would have been on a medieval hearth. A medieval hearth would have had a person whose sole job it would have been practically to actually manage the fire. And anyone doing the cooking on a medieval hearth would have had an innate understanding of how hot different parts of the hearth were based on the temperature of the coal, on the color of the coals, on the color of the flames. They would have just known that they would have needed to lift the pot higher or lower it, or scoot more coals towards it or scoot more coals away from it. A big component of medieval cooking is fire management. It's a lot fussier than modern cooking is. It required actually a lot more skill to successfully cook food on a medieval hearth than it does on a stove like we have now. Which is one of the reasons our recipes can be, I mean, their recipes weren't simple, but we can have all these really fussy recipes now because we have stoves that are very easy to control, right? When the second your stove gets less easy to control, the second you have less fussy recipes. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and scoot the onions kind of out of the way to make room for our chicken pieces. Just going to kind of push the onions up to the sides. And this is a technique I've actually seen in Turkey on a traditional Turkish skillet. One of the really giant, huge round ones where they're cooking over a fire. I've actually seen them first saute the sofrito, push it off to the sides in a concentric ring, and then put the meat thing in the middle to cook next. So I'm going to do that here. Just laying it. I'm putting these in specifically skin down so that will actually cook, sort of render the fat out of the skin. And apparently without really thinking about it, I divided it up by breasts are in one pot, and I don't like that. I'm going to mix it up between the two pots. I'm going to put some pieces of each, splitting my chicken in half, basically. Okay, and as I said, I am saving the back for making chicken stock, chicken broth, bone broth for the win. Washing my hands. Okay. Now, because of the nature of these pots, I'm actually going to now take the onions and kind of scoop them up and put them on top of the chicken so that the chicken can come into more contact with the surface of the pot. Sure these pots are centered more or less. Okay. And while those continue cooking, I'm going to go ahead and the onions smell so nice. That smell of that delicious rich smell of slightly caramelized onions. Yeah, that's a winner right there. Yeah, I agree, Gilles. Pot au feu when you've come back from, being out in the cold. Yeah, that's pretty delicious. Oh, was there a question about phyllo dough? I'm sorry. Yes. So phyllo dough. Yeah. Think exactly. think baklava layers. Yep. Really super fine dough in multiple layers. My great grandmother used to make that by hand from scratch. And then Pillsbury came out with a phyllo dough that you could get in the freezer section. And she realized she would never have to make it from scratch again. And she was okay with that, actually. She was perfectly okay with that. Oh, but there's another funny family story from my culinary story for my history. So apparently when my great-great-grandmother died, so my great-grandmother, my phyllo dough making great-grandmother's mother, when she died, my great-great-grandfather was sitting in the kitchen and of this house that he had built for the family that's still there in Passaic, New Jersey. He was sitting at the kitchen table crying, and he was sad because his wife had died, my great-great-grandmother. But the reason he was sad, because as he sobbed, I will never get to taste her phyllo dough again. Because apparently she made such amazing phyllo dough. So he was heartbroken that there would be no more great-great-grandmother phyllo dough for him. Nice to know that he cared about the things that mattered, right? Oh, goodness. It's the little things that matter, that you have access to tasty homemade phyllo dough. Yeah, onions and garlic are real key, but so in medieval cuisine, they use garlic a lot in sauces, but it's not used as much in actual cooking. So garlic is a big, very prominent ingredient in medieval cuisine, but it tends to be used more in the sauces and less in the cooking. There's one sauce called Saracen sauce, and it's walnuts and garlic, and it's amazing. It is absolutely, and sauce is it's labeled as a sauce. I would call it more of a condiment, honestly. It's a dip. And it's basically just walnuts and garlic and olive oil crushed together. And it is, it is spoonable. It is, as in, you would be very happy to eat it by the spoonful. So I'm just actually using my hands to manually squeeze out the rest of that pomegranate almond milk. Man, making almond milk has never been so dangerous for my clothing. Walnuts and garlic. Super yummy, my friend. Super delicious. And so the thing is, a lot of meats like this, the fact that this meat comes in such a flavorful, pomegranate juice milk is really tasty. Now I've got it all over my hands. It feels like my hands have had a spa day. I want to stir, so I need my hands not covered in pomegranate almond milk. The medieval, oh shoot, that was burning. medieval, there are a lot of medieval roasting is a very popular way of preparing meat in the Middle Ages, and boiling. And so they would actually then just serve the meat at the table, cut up to your spot, and they would serve it with lots of dipping sauces. Dipping sauces are the way that you keep roast meat interesting in the medieval world. And medieval recipe collections are nearly always filled with a huge variety of dipping sauces. You know, ones that are heavily spiced, vinegar and spices, herbs, combination of herbs and spices, where you use nuts, like in the case of that Saracen sauce, as a kind of carrier for the flavors. But you would basically, these sauces would be served in little dishes, and you would actually dip your meat in the sauce. And there was medieval etiquette to properly dipping your meat in the sauce. Like, you're not supposed to double dip. You're not supposed to stick your fingers in the sauce. You're supposed to have the meat in your fingers. Only the meat touches the sauce, and you don't bite the meat and then put the meat back in the sauce, because it's shared sauce dishes. You dip the meat, you put it in your mouth, and you eat the whole thing, right? So there's actually etiquette surrounding things like how you dip your meat in the sauce. So I know some people imagine the medieval world as this crude, rude place with no rules, and every dirt and grime and chicken bones on the floor, and people just being absolutely disgusting at table, but couldn't be further from the truth. And we can tell what kinds of expectations average people had by the kind of satire, right? When characters are being satired or shown to be disgusting, then they have rude table manners. But when they're shown as being good, proper people, they're depicted as having good table manners, right? Like, even we would recognize it as good table manners. So the medieval world was just not as crude and rude as people imagine. Okay, just going to flip our pieces of meat so that the other side can now get a little brown. Oh, interesting thing about glazed clay pots, by the way, they are non-stick, more or less. So, you know, if you're ever looking for a non-stick option that is not Teflon and Co., PFOA, then you might want to look at replica medieval cooking pots that are glazed on the inside. Unglazed medieval cooking pots will stick to hell and back, so just you be forewarned. Let's see if I can. I'm going to bring you guys over closer for a moment. That's one. And that's two. Yep. Oh, Kay Meeks, welcome back. Lovely to see you. Yeah, looking good. When were chickens introduced to Europe? I haven't found the earliest date because I haven't looked back that far, but they were here at least by the 8th century BC. So a long time ago. Jungle birds spread from Asia really early on. That's actually, chickens come from Asia, from Southeast Asia, and they were jungle fowl, and they spread pretty early on. Humans apparently recognized that their meat was tasty and that they would breed really well, and that they're pretty they take care of themselves for the most part, especially the heirloom breeds. Obviously, some of those modern broiler breeds in the U.S. are definitely, no, they can't take care of themselves anymore. But we've bred them to be stupid so that they would be fat. But otherwise, you know, chickens just make a really convenient form of livestock to have. They eat grubs. You don't even have to feed them, really, if you live in the right kind of environment. They feed themselves. So chickens spread really early on. Isn't the term medieval come about in the 15th century, as in the 13th century referred to it as someone else? Yeah, so the term medieval, people in the Middle Ages didn't refer to themselves as the Middle Ages, because the term medieval literally means the era between the between era. And the betweenness is represented by the ancient world and the modern world. So medieval is a modern term because you can't have it until you have a modern era. And this is going to shock some people, but the modern era actually starts in the 16th century with the Reformation. That is the start of the modern era. So no, the medieval people didn't refer to themselves as living in any era particularly. The term the Renaissance, that is coined in the 16th century by a bunch of bunch of Italian artists who viewed themselves very humbly and very modestly as the rebirth of classical civilization and art. So very humble. Yeah, so the term Renaissance was invented in the 16th century as a self-identifier. And actually, it's I think that the earliest, that might have been about the time that the term medieval was coined, but I think the term medieval actually came a little bit later. Yeah, people in the 15th century didn't really view themselves as living in any particular era in that regard, except that they knew they were after antiquity, right? They weren't antiquity. They understood that. They did refer to the ancient world as antiquity. Right. And there were people in like the 14th century. Petrarca is the first one to acknowledge that he said that they were living in a dark age. It's Petrarca who first proposes the idea of the dark age and that they were in it because he survived the Black Death, right? He survived the bubonic plague in the middle of the 14th century, one of the, if not the most traumatic event that has ever rocked human civilization, right? The bubonic plague completely didn't just decimate, it basically killed 60% of Europe's population. It was massively impactful and in a very short amount of time, and he lived through it, and he watched his friends die one by one of the plague. And so he actually writes at one point that we are living in an age of ash and shadow. And he's the one who starts talking about how wonderful it was, one of the first people anyway, who starts talking about how wonderful it was during the Pax Romana, during the glory of the Roman Empire. And that's because in Italy in the 13th and 14th and 15th century is war-torn. It is warlords all over the place. It's backstabbing, it's factions, it's civil war. It's a mess. I mean, there's some good things about living in Italy, but there's some really bad things about living in Italy in that era. And so there was this myth of the Pax Romana. There was almost a collective memory of this golden era when Italy was peaceful under the great Augustus Caesar, right? So that's when philosophers and thinkers in Italy started really thinking, if we want the Pax Romana again, we need to educate ourselves the way the Romans who created the Pax Romana were educated. Because if we do that, then we will have the tools to create our own Pax Romana. Unfortunately, that didn't work at all. They spent 150 years with classically educating the great and the good across the Italies, and it didn't result in the Pax Romana somehow. Yeah, history's fun. Okay. So I'm just going to turn the heat off for a moment while I address something that's been building up here. Okay. So something to note about clay pots. When you are cooking with clay pots, they will retain heat for a very long time. So you really don't have to, I got distracted. I meant to turn the heat off a while ago. Because once they get warm, they will stay warm for quite a while, longer than metal will. So you want to keep that in mind. And we have here, so I've got here a little bit of burning that was happening here, and I'm trying to ascertain how, it's dark brown. I'm trying to ascertain how burnt it is, so. Okay, so what I'm going to do actually, to save this dish, because it's gotten a little too burnt on the bottom here, this is a trick you can use for your own things. So first off, let me say that medieval cookbooks or medieval manuals of household management, such as the Ménagier de Paris, actually talk about techniques for saving a dish if it starts to burn. So what he says is, what the menager, the Goodman of Paris says, he says, remove, don't scrape the bottom, first off. This still applies to this day. Remove the contents of the pot from the pot without scraping the bottom, right? And then he says to add them to a fresh pot, and that will fix it. That's what he says. He says if it starts burning, do not stir it at all. Scrape it, don't scrape it. Don't scrape the bottom. So that's what we're doing here. And I'll show you what happened because I got distracted talking to you all as I like to do and sharing information with you. Yeah, cast iron also stays hot, but I was referring more towards your standard steel pots. Yep, absolutely. Cast iron does stay hot. Okay, so you can see that ring. That's not part of the coloration. And I can tell that some of that is much darker than I would like it to be. And I don't really like the taste of carbon in my food. So I've just pulled everything out and I've put it in a bowl. And I'm going to actually just transfer it now to, I don't have any other clay pots. I've maxed out my clay pots. So I'm going to put it into, sadly, a regular modern pot. But there it is for the next step. And again, I am going to use a modern rubber scraper because I don't believe in waste. I come from a family where we are professional scrapers of pots and pans and bowls. I have the rubber scraping technique down to a fine science, or maybe an art and a science, perhaps. I refuse to let anything get left behind in my bowls because every little bit counts towards building a dish and its flavor. I don't understand people who make cake, for instance, and they leave half the batter in the bowl because they just want to scrape the bowl. Or worse yet, when they're making a cake which relies on very careful chemistry, and they've mixed the wet ingredients in a separate bowl and the dry ingredients in a separate bowl. They add the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients and leave like a third of the wet ingredients sticking to the sides of the bowl. All those wet ingredients are essential for those dry ingredients. Rubber scraper for the win. No, they did not have rubber scrapers in the Middle Ages. I haven't seen anything that could even remotely replace it. Some people have theorized fingers, and fingers would be effective, the side of your hand, but I'm not that dedicated to medieval living history to use my fingers and the side of my hand. Not happening. Yeah, I think sometimes cultures are too diverse to be put under one banner. 100% K-Meeks. Agree with that absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I always say that whenever anyone asks me a question about the Middle Ages, my caveat is always it's 1,000 years of history and it's an entire continent if you're just talking about Europe. And that is not monolithic. There's nothing monolithic about any of that. And so your mileage is going to vary. Even across the broad strokes, it's still going to vary. So, I always try to caveat that. But people like things to be kept simple, and I only have so much time in my life. So when answering questions, sometimes I have to give generalizations, but it's always with the understanding that the more specific you get, the more different things get. Okay, so we are now at see, I never feel like I get enough out. Like I always feel there's more liquid that I can squeeze out of my almond mash for almond milk. For those who are wondering, this is pomegranate juice almond milk that we're making here. We crushed almonds that have been pre-soaked and not peeled, shelled, husked, but not peeled. We crushed them in a giant mortar and pestle, adding pomegranate juice and lemon juice as we went along. And now we're just trying to squeeze out the last of that almond milk. And there always seems to be more. No matter how much I squeeze, there always seems to be more. After a certain point, I just have to accept that there will always be more and I have to move on with my life. Deep philosophy with the Contessa. Welcome, thank you for joining us today. Yep, broad strokes, exactly. In some cases, And there are some things that are sort of generally true. For instance, across all of Europe, Africa, and Asia, there were no tomatoes, potatoes, corn, or capsicum before 1492. That is true. Broad strokes sometimes do in fact apply. There's some crazy conspiracy theories, not conspiracy theories, but crazy theories here in Korea, for instance, amongst nationalist historians that claim that Korea has had the go-to, the red chili pepper since time immemorial, and that it was brought across the Pacific Ocean by a bird. The seeds were. And so they've always had them. It's like, no, you really haven't. That's just simply not true. We can document the arrival of the go-to in Korea. Yeah, K-Meeks. The Pacific, the widest body of water on the planet, and the bird carried just the seeds across from Central America. Oh, God, yeah. Okay, I give up. That's just gonna have to be good enough. Pomegranate almond milk for the win. I will say, so modern sweet almonds don't really have much of an almond flavor. This really just tastes mostly like, or smells mostly like pomegranate, but the fat from the almonds will definitely create a very specific, texture ultimately as this cooks down. So we are now on to the next phase of our recipe, Romania, from the Liber de Coquina from 13th century Sicily. We are at the phase of strain the almond milk, which we did, just finished finally doing, and boil with the chickens, stirring with a spoon. So that is the phase at which we're at. We're basically at the end stage of this recipe. So I'm going to go ahead and add some of the almond milk pomegranate juice here, and then I will add it to the other pan as well. And again, the recipe doesn't say to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I am going to make certain that I maximize getting all of the pomegranate almond milk out of the bowl. I'm actually just going to add some water to the bowl and swish it around, because a little more water will just cook out. It will be fine.
Everybody drink.
Oh, what was the latest comment?
No, you said the recipe doesn't say it, but I'm going to do it anyway.
This is another method that I use to make sure I don't leave anything behind. Look, we're obsessive about not wasting in my household. I was born to do medieval living history, basically. I grew up very much in a family where we found any way we could to not waste. Wasting leftovers. Oh, no, that's a cardinal sin, my dear. Okay, let me just move us over to here. They totally were never visited by anyone else, just the magic bird. Yeah, K-Meeks. Yeah, Husafel, it's fantasy. Okay, so give this a stir. Now, lids for pots. This, modern recipes will say something like cover it or partially cover it. Sometimes medieval recipes do say that, and some don't. And some sources will be consistent about it, and some will never mention at all. But here's what you should know. If you are cooking over an actual fire or over actual coals, you're going to want to cover this. So anyone can guess why you will want to cover this if you're cooking on an actual open hearth. So if you don't cover it, you will end up with something that tastes burnt and like charcoal, because it will absorb the smoke. And there's actually the Ménagier de Paris. This actually has its own. The Ménagier de Paris actually talks about how you can rescue a dish that has absorbed the smell of the smoke. And damn it, it was very clever. It was something yes, right. He says, oh, he's clever. It's very clever. It's something you could apply modernly, actually. So one of the modern techniques for removing a smoky smell from something, like if it tastes burnt, is actually to put potatoes in it, cook it for a while, and then you take the potatoes out and the potatoes help absorb it. Also, if you put too much salt in a dish, you can use potatoes to absorb the excess salt. But he actually says to take a wet cloth and put it, oh no, sorry, this is to prevent, there was another method, I'm trying to remember the method for removing the smoky smell, but to prevent it from getting smoky, if you don't want to put a full lid on it, he says to put a wet cloth on top of your pot and keep changing it out. Every time it dries, re-wet it again and put it back on. And that will prevent the smoke from actually infiltrating your dish. And he did have a technique. He's the same guy who talks about how to save a pot that's burning, but he had a technique for rescuing the dish if it had already absorbed the burnt flavor. And I just don't remember what it was offhand. I'm gonna have to go look that up again. Going to have to look that up. The Goodman of Paris is just a fantastic resource, not just for medieval household management, but for modern as well. It's got so many great kitchen hacks in it. Yep. What are you cooking? Oh, Stella, grüß dich. Herzlich willkommen. Yeah, we are in the process, and we've actually just we're at the final stage, the actual cooking stage of making pomegranate. I'll show you what it looks like in the pot. Making medieval Sicilian pomegranate chicken. So here we go. Oh, sorry, that swang. I wasn't expecting it to swing like that. That's one of the two pots. And then that one. Right. And so now we're at the phase where it's just basically going to cook down. So this is going to take hours probably. Because it's a long stewing process, right? So, but there's one final thing that we do at the end. According to this recipe, it's at the end where we add spices. It's the very last thing. It says to add spices. And what kind of spices are we going to add? So, just spices, right? So there were lots of spice blends in medieval Europe. Just like modern Indian cuisine and historical Indian cuisine has spice blends. Medieval Europe also had spice blends, and not just herb blends, not just herbe de Provence, right? But actual spice blends, lots of them. There were sweet spices, strong spices, fine spices, and everyone, just like, garam masala in India now every household seems to make it differently and with different combinations and ratios of spices. The same thing applies to medieval spice blends. So it was very unlikely that any dish you had was going to taste the same anywhere you went, even in the same modern day country, right? So I have here a spice blend called fine spices, and it is from a recipe, a 14th century recipe collection, and this is a combination of cardamom, green cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, and galangal, and it has such a really lovely, rich smell. And chicken Fesanjan. Oh, I can roll down the. You can see all the. It worked. It worked. My apron captured a lot of the spatters from the pomegranate juice. Right. The chicken Fesanjan, the Persian version of this dish, often has cinnamon in it these days. It's often made with cinnamon. So the fact that this spice blend has a preponderance of cinnamon in it makes it feel like it's the right choice of spices for this. But maybe not. Who knows? Sicily is in the middle of the Mediterranean, and they would have had access to basically everything, right? Sicily gets everything first. Sicily gets cotton cultivation first. It gets silk cultivation first. It gets silk production first, right? So Sicily just gets like everything first, relative to the rest of Europe. And so, it could have been other spices, but that's what we're going to go with today. So, that's another way in which these recipes can be flexibly interpreted. What are spices? One of the ways you could maybe, if you really wanted to be true to the specific source, you could read through all the other recipes in that source And maybe some of them will actually specify spices for other dishes, which gives you an idea of the kind of spices that might have been used in that particular repertory. But sometimes they never do. Sometimes they never specify what the spices are, because you should know. And if you don't know, then maybe you shouldn't be making this recipe. And that's not me saying that. I'm pretty certain that's a level of snobbery that is inherent in these recipe collections. If you don't know, you shouldn't even be trying. Where am I from? I am originally from the small but absolutely charming state of Delaware in the United States. If you have not been to Delaware, you should absolutely go. It is a gem of a state with beautiful historical architecture, beautiful parks, beautiful beaches, not very touristed at all, glorious grand homes from the DuPonts and from the colonial era in United States history. It's small, very safe, very low violent crime, so it's a nice place to visit. But I left there when I was 22, and I immigrated to Germany, where I studied at the Universität Heidelberg. Übersetzung, actually. I studied translation there, and then I lived in Germany and worked in Germany for 12 years. And then I moved to Korea, and then I moved back to the US, and then I moved back to Korea and back to the US. And right now we're just visiting Korea, but we're hoping to set up shop here a little more permanently as soon as we possibly can. So I'm a little bit from all over, I guess you could say. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, HH, welcome back. It's been a while. Right. Okay, well, everyone, this is actually going to take a little while to cook. So are there any final questions about medieval cooking? Or we've also been going for almost 3.5 hours about medieval cooking, about daily life in the Middle Ages, medieval clothing, medieval dance. Otherwise, I've got a bunch of live streams will be coming up. We'll be doing some medieval sewing parties. We'll be doing more cooking. I'm hoping to do some live medieval dance practices, actually, because I need to practice up the dances that I'm going to be teaching at this big 2-week medieval fair that happens in Western Pennsylvania every year at the end of July, called Penzic, where I'll be teaching a whole lot of medieval dance classes and leading a ball. And I will be live streaming all of that for you. So if you're interested to see what my 15th century Contessa lifestyle is like in vivo, then make sure to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. I'd like to thank all of you, like Michia Makes, who left me with gifts and also with super chats today. I'd like to thank my channel members and patrons and my Facebook subscribers for supporting my explorations of medieval living history and enabling me to share it with you all. If you'd like to support my work, but also would like access to extra content, to full-length video tutorials, to footage I never share with anyone, to extra resources, and to my Creative Contessa Discord server, and consider becoming a channel member or a patron or a Facebook member. And recently I learned that YouTube takes a huge chunk of your membership fees. By the way, they take 30%. So if you want more of the money to come to me and less to go to YouTube or whomever, Patreon apparently is the one who takes the smallest cut. They only take like 10 or 12%. Welcome to the world. Okay, let's see. Let me see. Oh, HH, I totally get it. Many people have been busy lately. You know, I'm just glad you're back. This process seems similar to brewing. Were medieval practices similar in both practices? So do you mean medieval brewing practices? So medieval brewing, from what I understand about it, I'm not a brewer, but I have learned some things about it. So if you're talking about beer specifically, beer, the basic idea is very similar, and they started malting actually pretty early on, as far as I understand. Hops does not become the common spice that gets, or herb that gets added to ale as a preservative until the 15th century. Before that, they had different herb blends, and each brewer apparently would add different herbs to the ale as a preservative. So ale would have just tasted so very different, I think, than modern ale or beer would have. And of course, they were also brewing in wooden barrels, and the barrels would absorb the microbiota from the beer, and that would actually generally start to infuse the wood with both flavor, but also its own kind of colony of microbes. which means that the beer that you're getting on what from week to week might taste completely different, and certainly from brewer to brewer is going to taste very different, even if it's from the exact same ingredients. So, yeah, I would say that sorry, we've reached boiling. I have to give it a stir. I would say that the basic premise of brewing is the same, but the specific flavors that resulted were probably quite different. Because now, you know, brewing, they use, especially commercial brewing, uses stainless steel vats. They use metal vats. So you're not getting any of that patina of accrued microbial development and flavor that you would from a medieval brewing process. Did that answer your question? Was that what you were hoping? Was that what you were intending to ask? Yeah, I will. Once the chicken is done, guys, once the chicken is done, I'm anticipating this is probably going to take an hour or two. Once the chicken is done, I will absolutely post about it and show you the pictures and maybe do a little taste test, and hopefully it will turn out good. Yeah, K Meeks, did that answer your question about brewing? I hope. And here I have my now pomegranate dyed cheesecloth and my pomegranate dyed and flavored almond mash. So I'm going to see if I can figure some good use for that. I tried something the other day. I tried making a kind of like a bread pudding, but with eggs, an egg and cream based thing. It actually turned out pretty decent. The texture was a little weird because the almonds don't get as soft and mushy as walnuts do, for instance. So the texture was a little not the best, but the flavors were good. So if I can maybe figure out a way to mash the almonds even more finely, then you might be able to make like an egg and cream pudding with it. A baked pudding. Yeah. Okay, well, everyone, if you've been enjoying, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, everyone, tomorrow I will be doing a medieval sewing party, medieval getting dressed and medieval sewing party. So join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, everyone, stay creative. Wow, it does not want to go off.